before the first star had drawn its arc across an empty sky, before light had learned to travel, before the concept of distance existed to be crossed, there was nothing. Not darkness. Darkness implies a canvas, not silence. Silence implies a space in which sound could form and fail. There was simply the absence of everything, absolute and without dimension, without duration, without witness. And then, from within that absence, something stirred. A single egg materialized in the void. No one placed it there. No force summoned it. It simply appeared, as though the universe had always been waiting for precisely this moment to begin, and had finally grown patient enough to act. If stories like these keep you watching into the early hours, consider subscribing. There is always more to uncover. What follows is the complete account of how a universe came to exist, how it nearly broke apart, and how, in the spaces between catastrophe and calm, the mythical and legendary Pokémon who shaped every age of history found their places in the long, breathing story of a world still unfolding. The egg rested in the void for what could not be measured, because time did not yet exist to do the measuring. The ancient texts of the Sinnoh region, preserved in stone tablets and oral traditions passed between scholars across uncounted generations, described this state not as waiting, but as potential. The void was not empty. It was full of everything that had not yet decided to become. And at the center of that fullness, the egg turned slowly in a direction that had no name, warming from within, building toward a threshold. When Arceus hatched, the universe cracked open with it. The legends do not describe a gentle emergence. The records carved into the walls of the Hall of Origin speak instead of a shattering, a release of energy so fundamental that the act of becoming divided the nothing into something and the something into everything. Arceus emerged from its shell and looked out into a space that had no shape, no boundary, no content. What it perceived in that first moment, no record has ever been able to say. What the records do say is what happened immediately afterward. Arceus did not rest. The creature that would come to be called the original one moved through the formless space it had created simply by existing in it, and from the movement of its 1,000 arms, each one a different force, a different expression of will and matter, the foundations of a universe began to accumulate. The shimmer of that first light was not warm. It was the cold, precise illumination of pure energy organizing itself, a blue-white radiance that cast no shadows because shadows require surfaces, and surfaces did not yet exist. Arceus generated those surfaces next, pressing matter into being from the space between its movements, and the first particles of what would eventually become stone and water and atmosphere drifted outward from the center of its passage, like dust disturbed by a hand moving through still air. The Sinnoh texts are careful to separate what Arceus created directly from what it created through delegation. The world itself, the ground, the sky, the fundamental fabric of reality, emerged from Arceus alone. But the sustaining forces, the mechanisms that would allow that reality to persist and evolve across time, required specialized attention. And so Arceus turned its focus inward, and from itself, from the matter of its own being, it generated 3 eggs. These eggs were not like the one from which Arceus had emerged. They were deliberate. Each one carried within it a specific purpose, a specific domain of existence that Arceus understood the universe would need in order to function across anything longer than a single moment. From the first egg emerged Dialga, and with Dialga came time. From the second came Palkia, and with Palkia came space. From the third came Giratina, and with Giratina came something harder to name. The antimatter, the negative space, the inverse of everything that the first two had made possible. The three moved through the nascent universe, like architects surveying a newly cleared site, each one taking up its function with the certainty of something that had been built for exactly this purpose. Time began to flow, space began to extend, and the universe, which had only existed as a fact until this moment, began to exist as a place. The arrangement did not hold without incident. Giratina was the third creation, and the texts treat its earliest behavior with the same measured steadiness they apply to everything else. But the consequence they describe was not measured at all. The nature of antimatter, as Giratina embodied it, was not simply the opposite of matter. It was the force that made matter meaningful by providing its contrast, the shadow that gave light a shape to define itself against. But Giratina's expression of that force was violent in a way that the young universe could not absorb without damage. The records describe the disturbances it caused as fundamental, not destructive in the way that fire destroys wood, but destabilizing in the way that a crack in a foundation destabilizes everything built above it. Arceus observed these disturbances as they accumulated, and the original one made a decision. Giratina was banished. The dimension created to contain it was not a punishment in the way that later civilizations might have understood the concept. Arceus did not act in anger. The ancient accounts are clear on this point. The banishment was a structural solution to a structural problem. Giratina's energy, uncontained in the primary universe, threatened the coherence of everything Arceus had built and everything Dialga and Palkia were sustaining. A separate dimension, one shaped by antimatter's own logic, one where the rules of the primary universe were inverted and Giratina's nature could operate without tearing the fabric of the world apart. This was not a cage so much as a domain, a place where what Giratina was could exist fully without destroying what everything else was. The distortion world took shape around Giratina like a second universe folded inside the first. Its geography obeyed no stable law. Waterfalls climbed upward. Platforms floated without support. Gravity selected its own direction moment by moment, as though the concept of down had never been settled upon and was still being negotiated. The light there was not the cold blue-white of Arceus's creation. It was a dim, amber gray, the color of something that had once been bright and had since learned to persist in a diminished form. Giratina moved through it with the ease of a creature that had found in its exile something that fit the shape of what it was. The exile changed Giratina in ways the primary universe would not observe for a very long time. Isolated from the flow of time that Dialga sustained and the extension of space that Palkia maintained, Giratina developed a relationship with the boundary between the two dimensions, the membrane that separated the distortion world from the world of the living. It learned that membrane, pressed against it, found the places where it was thinnest, and in those thin places, Giratina could observe the primary universe as though through a fog, present but unreachable, watching the world it had been removed from continue its long development without it. The records that survived in Sinnoh preserved this exile not as a tragedy, exactly, but as a condition. Giratina persisted, the universe persisted, and the membrane between them held as long as the forces that maintained it remained in balance. That balance, as later events would demonstrate, was never guaranteed. In the quiet that followed the first age of creation, when the universe had settled into its new rhythms, and the three great powers had taken up their separate domains, something else moved through the young world, something small, something that left no monuments and built no structures and drew no attention to itself in the way that gods draw attention simply by existing at scale. Mew drifted through the early world like a question the universe had asked itself and then forgotten to answer. The records surrounding Mew are not carved in stone tablets or preserved in formal texts the way the Sinnoh creation myths are. They exist instead in the genetic architecture of every Pokémon species that has ever lived, a record written not in language, but in biology, in the deep structural patterns of cellular information that researchers studying Pokémon genetics would eventually, thousands of years after the fact, trace back to a single common source. Mew carried within its small body the complete genetic sequence of all Pokémon. Not a blueprint, not a template, but the full and living library. Every adaptation, every evolutionary branch, every form that any Pokémon had ever taken or would ever take, held in potential within a creature that weighed almost nothing and moved through the world with the lightness of something that had never needed to be afraid of anything. The scientific understanding of Mew's significance developed gradually, assembled from fragments across multiple regions and research disciplines. What the researchers eventually concluded, and what the oldest mythological accounts had always suggested in different language, was that Mew was not simply old. Mew was prior. It existed before the branching of species, before the divergence of forms, before the long process of adaptation and selection that had produced the extraordinary diversity of Pokémon life across every ecosystem on the planet. Every Pokémon that lived carried a version of something that Mew had carried first. The practical consequence of this was a kind of invisibility. Mew was everywhere the genetic record of life was, which meant Mew was everywhere, and yet Mew itself was almost never seen. The creature had learned, or perhaps had simply always known, that existing near the surface of things invited attention, and attention invited disruption. Mew moved through tall grass and dense forest with a translucent shimmer that the eye slid past without registering. It hovered at the edges of populated areas, curious about the civilizations that had grown from the life it had seeded, but never quite willing to be incorporated into them. The warmth of its presence was something people occasionally felt without being able to name, a sense of something benign and ancient nearby, a feeling that dissipated the moment they turned to look for its source. What made Mew's genetic significance more than a biological curiosity was the implication it carried about the nature of Pokémon life itself. If all Pokémon descended from a single ancestor, then the diversity of the world, the fire-breathing and the water-breathing, the burrowing and the soaring, the microscopic and the mountainous, was not a collection of separate creations, but a single expression of one original potential, branching and branching and branching across geological time into forms that bore less and less surface resemblance to one another while remaining, at the deepest level, variations on a single theme. Mew was that theme. Every other species was a consequence of it. The texts that eventually reached the researchers who would attempt to replicate Mew's genome described this not in scientific language, but in the language of myth. The original Pokémon, the one who holds all forms, the creature from which all others came. The myth and the science arrived at the same conclusion through different paths, and the convergence of those paths was itself a kind of evidence, a suggestion that the stories the ancient world told about Mew had been in their way accurate all along. Far to the east of where Mew drifted through its quiet, unobserved existence, the land that would become the Johto region was taking shape across the centuries into something that felt, to the people who lived there, like a place that had always been inhabited by the sacred. The mountains rose in layers behind the coastal settlements, each ridge darker and more distant than the last, and the air in the high passes carried the smell of pine resin and cold stone and something else. Something that the people of Johto described in their oldest songs as the breath of something that had passed through recently and not yet fully departed. Ho-Oh arrived in the memory of Johto before it arrived in its recorded history. The legends that accumulated around Ho-Oh did not begin with a single witnessed event. They began with a feeling, a sense among the people of the region that the sky above certain mountains was not merely sky, that the light that gathered at the peaks of the brass tower before dawn carried a quality distinct from ordinary morning light. The brass tower itself, which stood in the city that would come to be known as Ecruteak, was built as a place where Pokémon and humans might meet, a structure of such craftsmanship that it seemed to the people who built it worthy of drawing the attention of something extraordinary. And something extraordinary came. Ho-Oh descended from the upper atmosphere with a sound that the oldest accounts compared to all the bells of the world ringing at once, a tone that was not quite music and not quite thunder, something in the space between celebration and warning. Its plumage caught the light of every wavelength simultaneously, breaking into colors that shifted as it moved, so that witnesses standing at different angles saw different birds. One person seeing a creature of deep crimson, another seeing gold, another seeing a green that was almost too vivid to be real. The feathers it shed as it settled onto the brass tower were said to bring happiness to any who found them, and the people of Ecruteak preserved those feathers with the care they gave to their most sacred objects. For a time, Ho-Oh rested at the brass tower, and the city grew around that presence, the way settlements grow around springs, drawn by what the presence provided, shaped by the need to remain close to it. The three Pokémon that would come to be known as the legendary beasts, Raikou, Entei, and Suicune, were said in the Johto legends to have been ordinary Pokémon who perished when lightning struck the brass tower and fire consumed it. What Ho-Oh did next was not described in the texts as resurrection, in the way that later traditions might have used the word. It was described as transformation, the three Pokémon given new forms that matched the forces that had ended their first lives, thunder and fire and the rain that eventually extinguished the blaze, each one embodying the element of its own death and carrying forward into the world a life that had been made more than it was by the quality of its ending. Ho-Oh departed after the fire. The texts do not explain why. They record only that it rose from the ruins of the brass tower and climbed back into the sky, and that the light it carried with it was visible for a long time after the creature itself had become too distant to see. A fading warmth at the edge of the sky, the color of embers in the moment before they go dark. The people of Johto watched it go and built their understanding of the sacred around the shape of its absence, the way that something essential can leave a more distinct impression through its departure than it ever could through its presence. The legend held that Ho-Oh would return when the world produced a trainer of pure heart. That condition, its vagueness, its dependence on a quality that could not be measured or observed directly, was perhaps the most honest thing the legend contained. It acknowledged that the return was not a matter of schedule or geography. It was a matter of readiness. And readiness, the people of Johto understood, was not something that could be forced. In the forests of the Johto region, and in the dense woodlands that bordered it on every side, another presence moved through time in a way that time itself seemed to accommodate rather than constrain. Celebi was small, small enough that the trees it moved between dwarfed it, small enough that a person standing at the edge of the forest might see only a shimmer of green light between the leaves and mistake it for sunlight filtered through moving branches. But the shimmer moved against the wind, and occasionally it moved against time, and that was what made Celebi something other than an ordinary forest creature. The mythology of Celebi developed independently in several regions, but the accounts converged on the same fundamental understanding. Celebi was a traveler through time, not a traveler in the way that a person travels, moving from one point to another along a single path, but a traveler in the way that light travels, present at multiple points simultaneously, capable of arriving before it had departed and departing before it had arrived. The forests in which Celebi appeared were described in the old accounts as places where time ran differently, where the growth of a tree might seem to pause and then accelerate, where paths through the undergrowth shifted between visits in ways that could not be explained by the ordinary passage of seasons. The guardianship that Celebi exercised over these forests was not active in the way that a protector actively defends. It was temporal. Celebi's presence in a place meant that the place had a connection to every version of itself across time, that the ancient forest and the young forest and the forest as it would eventually become were all, in some sense, present simultaneously wherever Celebi moved. This made the forests, where Celebi had been seen, extraordinarily resilient. Damage that should have persisted, clearings cut by storms, paths worn bare by overuse, the slow encroachment of development at the edges, seemed to recover with a speed that exceeded what ecology alone could explain. The cost of this resilience was Celebi's own relationship with the present. Creatures that exist across multiple points in time simultaneously do not experience the present as a fixed location. For Celebi, the moment of now was less a place to stand than a direction to face, one option among many, chosen and abandoned with the same ease that a person might choose to look left or right. The old accounts described Celebi as joyful, and the word they used was specific, not the joy of achievement or reunion, but the joy of movement, of a creature that had never been required to stay anywhere long enough to lose what it loved about being there. What Celebi guarded, ultimately, was not the forest of the present, but the continuity of the forest across time. As long as Celebi moved through those woods, the oldest trees remembered being saplings, and the youngest saplings carried within them the memory of what the oldest trees had been. The forest was a single living thing stretched across centuries, and Celebi was the thread that held those centuries together. The thread, the ancient accounts noted carefully, was not unbreakable. There were forces that could disrupt temporal continuity, events of such violence or such scale that even Celebi's passage could not stitch them back together cleanly. When those disruptions occurred, the forests felt them. The growth patterns shifted. The paths moved in ways that confused rather than guided. And Celebi, somewhere in the fold between one moment and another, turned its attention to the damage and began the long, patient work of repair. While Celebi tended the forests and Ho-Oh watched the sky above Johto, the mechanisms that held the universe together continued their work in the high places of the world, in the space between things, in the dimensions that ordinary life never touched. Dialga and Palkia had been present since the first age of creation, sustaining the twin pillars of existence, time and space, with a consistency so absolute that the civilizations developing beneath them experienced these forces as simply the nature of reality, as background as gravity, as unnoticeable as the air. But Dialga and Palkia were not passive. They were active, continuous, and enormous, not in the way that mountains are enormous, but in the way that the concept of direction is enormous, present in every moment, without being located in any single place. Dialga's body was built from the stuff of time itself, the metallic blue of its scales carrying a quality that observers in the Sinnoh region described as both ancient and immediate, as though looking at Dialga meant looking at the past and the future simultaneously, with the present as a thin line between them that the creature's movement made visible. The sound of Dialga's roar was said to alter the flow of time in its immediate vicinity, not dramatically, not in ways that rewrote history or unmade futures, but perceptibly in the way that a stone dropped in still water makes the surface move. Palkia occupied the complementary domain with a physicality that was somehow both massive and accommodating. Space, as Palkia sustained it, was not simply the empty distance between objects. It was the framework within which objects could exist separately from one another, the medium through which light and force and matter moved. Without Palkia's continuous maintenance of that framework, the fabric of spatial reality would not collapse so much as it would cease to make sense. Distances would become meaningless. Directions would lose their relationship to one another. The concept of elsewhere would dissolve. Palkia's pearl white and violet form moved through the dimensions with the authority of something that understood space as a native language rather than a learned one. The Sinnoh region preserved the mythology of Dialga and Palkia with more precision than most regions applied to their legendary accounts, because the people of Sinnoh had built their understanding of the universe directly around the creation myth of Arceus, and Dialga and Palkia were central to that myth. The temples at Spear Pillar, carved into the summit of the highest peak in the region, were oriented specifically toward the dimensional points where the two great forces were understood to be most present, most accessible to the world of ordinary matter, most capable of being addressed, or, in the worst circumstances, disturbed. The worst circumstances arrived more than once. The nature of the two forces meant that their domains were not entirely separate. Time and space were not independent pillars, but interlocking ones, each requiring the other to function coherently. When either was destabilized, the other felt it. When both were destabilized simultaneously, the consequences extended far beyond the immediate region of disruption. The Sinnoh legends recorded several such events across the deep history of the region, each one described with the same careful restraint, the sky taking on a quality that was not quite any color, the ground becoming uncertain beneath the feet of those standing on it, the sounds of the world dropping away, as though the medium through which they traveled had momentarily forgotten how to carry them. Each time, the balance was restored. Each time, the restoration left the world slightly different from what it had been before, not damaged exactly, but adjusted, the way a structure that has been stressed and then returned to stability carries the memory of the stress in its material, stronger in some places and more vulnerable in others. The universe that Dialga and Palkia sustained was not the same universe Arceus had created. It was the universe that had survived its own history, and the difference was written in every dimension of its being. The ocean between the land masses of the ancient world held its own histories, its own mythologies, its own conflicts that had shaped the coastlines and the depths in ways that the civilizations living above the water would eventually learn to read as landscape, but had once experienced as catastrophe. The origin of that shaping began with two forces that the Hoenn region's oldest accounts described not as creatures, exactly, but as processes, ongoing geological and hydrological events that had taken form, or perhaps forms that had generated geological and hydrological events, the causality running in both directions simultaneously. Groudon emerged from the deep heat of the earth, from the magma chambers and tectonic pressures that had been building since the planet's earliest formation, and its emergence was not a birth so much as a crystallization, the moment when dispersed force gathered itself into a single coherent entity and stepped out of the rock into the world it had been helping to build from beneath. The land expanded wherever Groudon moved. Continents shifted, new coastlines appeared where open water had been. The warmth that radiated from Groudon's body was not the comfortable warmth of sunlight, but the dry, pressing heat of stone that has absorbed the sun for an entire day and releases it slowly into the night. The heat of something that has stored more energy than it can easily contain. Kyogre rose from the deep ocean with an equal and opposite force, its form carrying the cold, dark blue of water that has never seen light, its passage through the upper ocean accompanied by the sound of pressure equalizing, a deep, resonant groan that the surface world registered as distant thunder even when the sky was clear. Where Groudon expanded land, Kyogre expanded ocean. The ancient Hoenn texts described the conflict between them not as a war in the sense of armies and strategy, but as the natural expression of two forces that occupied the same space and could not both be fully expressed simultaneously. When Groudon pushed the coastline outward, Kyogre pushed it back. When Kyogre raised the water level, Groudon raised the land to meet it. The conflict reshaped the Hoenn region across geological time, and the people who eventually settled there built their understanding of the land and sea around the memory of that reshaping, the way the mountains rose abruptly from the water, The way the ocean floor in certain places showed evidence of having once been exposed to open air, the way the weather patterns of the region carried an instability that seemed to remember the conflict even after it had ended. The ending came from above. Rayquaza had existed in the upper atmosphere for as long as Groudon and Kyogre had existed in the earth and the deep ocean, perhaps longer, perhaps from the same earliest moment when the forces of the young planet had first organized themselves into coherent entities. The ancient Hoenn texts described Rayquaza as a creature of the sky layer between the world and space, a serpentine presence that moved through the high atmosphere on currents that ordinary wind did not reach, feeding on the particles and meteoroids that drifted down from the cosmos above. Its body was the green of deep water seen from above, its length enormous beyond the capacity of ordinary scale to convey, its movement through the high atmosphere leaving behind a trail of pressure that the people far below sometimes perceived as a change in the quality of the light, a brightening at the edge of the sky, as though the atmosphere itself had shifted slightly. Rayquaza descended from its high domain when the conflict between Groudon and Kyogre reached a threshold that threatened not just the Hoenn region, but the stability of the wider world. The ancient account of that descent was not dramatic in the way that later retellings sometimes made it. Rayquaza did not arrive with fanfare or announcement. It came down through the layers of the atmosphere with the steady inevitability of something that had always been going to do this, that had been watching from above since the beginning, and had determined with the patience of a creature that measured time in geological epochs that the moment for intervention had arrived. The roar that Rayquaza produced when it descended was described as a sound that the earth felt rather than heard, a vibration that passed through stone and water and the bodies of every living thing in the region, carrying within it something that both Groudon and Kyogre recognized at the level of their most fundamental nature. The two great forces paused. The coastline stopped shifting. The water stopped rising and falling with the violence it had carried for what felt like an age. And in that pause, Rayquaza's authority over both of them became clear, not an authority granted by Arceus or any other power, but an authority earned by presence, by the simple fact of having occupied the sky above them since the beginning and having waited without urgency for the moment when its intervention would be decisive. Groudon descended back into the earth. Kyogre sank back into the ocean depths. The coastlines of Hoenn settled into the shapes they would hold for the centuries that followed, shaped by the conflict and stabilized by its resolution. Rayquaza returned to the upper atmosphere and resumed its ancient circuit of the sky, feeding on the particles of the cosmos and moving through the high air with the ease of something that had never been in any danger and had never doubted the outcome of what it had done. The sky above the ocean was Rayquaza's domain, but the ocean itself belonged to something else, something that had chosen the deep water not as a refuge but as a home, not as a place to hide, but as a place from which to listen to the world above, with the careful attention of a creature that understood the ocean's role as a medium of transmission, a vast body through which everything that happened at the surface eventually sent its echoes downward. Lugia moved through the deepest trenches of the ocean with a silence that the water itself had seemed to accommodate, parting around its passage and closing again behind it without turbulence, as though the ocean had learned the shape of Lugia's movement and made way for it as a matter of long habit. The creature's form was pale, the white of something that has existed at depth long enough to take on the quality of the water around it, tinged at the wing edges with the blue-gray of deep water where light no longer reached. Its wingspan, when extended, was a measurement that the ocean could accommodate more easily than the sky, and the records that described Lugia in flight above the surface did so with a note of incongruity, something built for depth, briefly and deliberately visiting the air. The connection between Lugia and the three legendary birds, Articuno, Zapdos, and Moltres, was described in the oldest Johto and Kanto accounts, with a precision that suggested the relationship was understood to be structural rather than merely associative. The three birds governed ice and lightning and fire, each one an expression of a fundamental atmospheric force, each one capable of weather events of regional scope when their energies were expressed fully. Individually, each was formidable. Together, without mediation, the three generated conflicts that the sky could not contain, storms of ice and lightning and fire that fed one another's intensities, weather systems of escalating severity that threatened everything beneath them. Lugia's role in relation to the three birds was that of a balancing weight, not a ruler, not a parent, but a counterforce, a presence whose nature was sufficiently distinct from the three that it could stand between them without being drawn into the conflict. The ocean, which Lugia embodied in some fundamental sense, was not ice or lightning or fire, but the medium that all three ultimately affected, the surface that froze, the water that conducted, the shore that burned. Lugia's authority over the three came from this completeness, from the fact that it was the thing that all three of them, in their conflicts, were ultimately altering. The Johto legends preserved this relationship in the story of the Whirl Islands, where Lugia was said to rest in the deepest chamber of the deepest cave, surrounded by the sound of water moving through stone passages in patterns that changed with the tides. The people who lived near the islands described the ocean in the surrounding area as behaving differently from the open sea, calmer in ways that had nothing to do with the weather, quieter in a way that suggested the water itself was listening for something, or was being listened to by something that paid very close attention to everything the ocean carried. When Lugia surfaced, the account said the weather changed. Not violently, Lugia's emergence was not a storm event, but a pressure change, a shift in the atmospheric conditions of the surrounding region that the birds felt at whatever distance they occupied and responded to by drawing back, reducing the intensity of their own expressions, settling into a kind of watchful quiet that lasted as long as Lugia remained visible above the waterline. The three birds did not fear Lugia. The accounts were clear on this point. They recognized it. And recognition, in the mythological language of the region, was a form of deference that operated below the level of choice. Lugia returned to the deep water when the balance had been restored, and the ocean closed over its passage with the same seamless silence it had opened with. The birds resumed their territories. The weather of the region settled back into its ordinary patterns, and the Whirl Islands sat at the center of their small archipelago, the sound of water through stone rising and falling with the tides, keeping whatever time Lugia kept in the darkness below. Across the ocean and far to the north and east, in the land that would become the Unova region, the oldest stories began not with a god or a cosmic force, but with two brothers. The myth of the ancient Unova kingdom was a human story before it became a Pokémon story, or rather, it was always both simultaneously, because the two brothers who founded the kingdom understood from the beginning that the relationship between humans and Pokémon was the central question of their world, and they spent their lives answering it in different ways. The kingdom they built together was by all accounts extraordinary. The records that survived, preserved in the libraries of Nakreen City and in the oral traditions of the people who lived in the shadow of the ancient castle, described a civilization of unusual sophistication, one built on the principle that humans and Pokémon were partners rather than tools, that the strength of the kingdom derived from the quality of that partnership rather than from the simple accumulation of power. The two brothers shared the governance of this kingdom with a complementarity that the legends described as near perfect. One brother, idealistic, oriented toward truth and the pure expression of what things were. The other, pragmatic, oriented toward ideals and the aspiration toward what things could become. From the two brothers, two dragons emerged, or perhaps the two dragons had always existed and found in the brothers the human counterparts that made their own natures comprehensible. Reshiram was fire and truth, a creature of white flame and absolute clarity, its body carrying the heat of something that burned away everything inessential and left only what was real. Zekrom was thunder and ideals, a creature of black lightning and absolute conviction, its body carrying the electric charge of something that moved toward what it believed without hesitation and without doubt. The two dragons were not opposites in the way that good and evil are sometimes called opposites. They were complements, each one a different expression of a quality that required the other to be fully understood, truth without ideals being mere fact, ideals without truth being mere fantasy. The kingdom flourished under the dual guardianship of the two dragons and the two brothers. The warmth of Reshiram's fire touched the agricultural lands of the kingdom and extended the growing season. The electrical energy of Zekrom powered the early mechanical innovations that the kingdom's craftspeople were developing. The partnership between the brothers and their dragons was the structural foundation of everything the kingdom had built, and for a long time, long enough that the people who lived in it began to experience that time as simply the way things were, the structure held. The fracture, when it came, was not dramatic in its origin. The accounts describe it as a disagreement, the kind of disagreement that begins as a difference of emphasis and accumulates through years of small reinforcements into something that cannot be bridged. The older brother believed that the kingdom's strength derived from truth, from seeing things clearly, from refusing to dress reality in comfortable fictions, from building on what was actually the case rather than what people wished were the case. The younger brother believed that the kingdom's strength derived from ideals, from the aspiration towards something better, from the willingness to pursue what ought to be even when what was fell short of it. Both positions were defensible. Both positions had built the kingdom, and yet the brothers could not find, in the end, the place where the two positions met. the dragons separated with the brothers. Reshiram aligned with truth, Zekrom with ideals, and the kingdom that had been built on their partnership fractured along the same line that had divided the brothers. The war that followed was not recorded in precise military detail. The accounts that survived were mythological rather than historical, concerned more with the nature of what was lost than with the sequence of how it was lost. What they recorded clearly was the aftermath. The kingdom destroyed, the brothers separated, and the two dragons, their partnership broken, retreating into stone. Literally, the account said, the two great creatures folding themselves into a latent state, their power contained within objects that would later be called the dark stone and the light stone, waiting in geological time for a moment when the world would again produce human partners capable of calling them forward. The stones rested in the earth of the Unova region for centuries, and the kingdom they had once guarded became a ruin, and the ruin became a landscape, and the landscape became a place where new cities grew without knowing what they were growing on top of. The memory of the kingdom persisted in the myths, and the myths persisted in the libraries, and the libraries persisted in cities that had been built by people who had inherited the consequences of the fracture without inheriting the full knowledge of what had caused it. In the far reaches of another region, in a landscape defined by the boundary between life and its ending, two forces older than any kingdom and more fundamental than any political disagreement maintained their ancient cycle with the indifference of processes that had never needed to be understood in order to function. Xerneas moved through the forests of the Kalos region with a quality that the people who encountered it described as the opposite of ordinary animal movement, not the wariness and efficiency of a creature navigating its environment, but the ease of something that was, in some sense, the environment itself, moving through its own substance. The deer-like form carried antlers that glowed with a light that shifted through the full spectrum of color as Xerneas moved, each color corresponding in the old accounts to a different aspect of life, the blue of water, the green of growth, the gold of warmth, the violet of transformation. Where Xerneas walked, the account said, life accumulated. Trees grew faster. Flowers opened out of season. Soil that had been depleted by drought or fire recovered with a speed that exceeded what rainfall alone could explain. The energy that Xerneas carried was not simply biological. It was generative at a more fundamental level, the force that made biology possible, the underlying condition of living things, expressed in a form that moved and breathed and occasionally rested beneath an ancient tree with the stillness of something that had been doing this for a very long time. The cycle required Yveltal. Yveltal occupied the complementary domain with a presence that the Kalos accounts described not as malevolent, but as necessary, the way that winter is necessary, the way that the ending of one thing is the condition for the beginning of another. The enormous avian form moved through the sky above the forests where Xerneas walked, its red and black wings carrying the thermal signature of something that absorbed rather than radiated, that drew energy inward rather than releasing it outward. The life force that Yveltal absorbed was not stolen. The accounts were careful about this distinction. It was gathered, collected from the world as it accumulated beyond what the world could sustain, taken up into Yveltal's body with the same naturalness that a forest floor takes up fallen leaves, processing what has ended into the material of what will begin. The mythology of Xerneas and Eviltal was structured around a cycle that operated across timescales no individual human life could observe in full. Xerneas released life energy into the world across an era, a period long enough that the forests of Kalos grew to extraordinary density, that the populations of living things across the region expanded to fill every available space, that the accumulated vitality of the landscape reached a kind of fullness that was itself a form of pressure. At the end of that era, Xerneas transformed, folded its life energy inward, took the form of a tree, and entered a dormancy that the accounts described as neither death nor sleep, but something between the two, a state of sustained potential that could last for 1,000 years. Eviltal's era followed. With Xerneas dormant and no longer releasing life energy into the world, the balance shifted. Yveltal moved through the landscape, absorbing the accumulated life force that the previous era had generated, not destroying what lived, but drawing the surplus back, reducing the world's biological intensity to a level that could be sustained across the long term, preparing the ground for the next era of Xerneas. At the end of Eviltal's era, the great bird also transformed, descended to the earth, became a cocoon, and entered its own dormancy, the absorbed life energy held within it in a form that would eventually be released back into the world when Xerneas woke. The two transformations did not happen simultaneously. There was always a period of overlap, a moment in the transition between one era and the next, when both forces were present in the world in their active forms, Xerneas waking from its tree sleep as Eviltal descended toward its cocoon sleep, the two forces passing one another at the boundary of their respective eras. The accounts described these transitional periods as the most vivid times in the history of the Kalos region, the air carrying both the warmth of life generating and the cool of life receding, the forests at their most extraordinary density, even as something in the quality of the light suggested that the long gathering was about to begin. The people of Kalos built their understanding of mortality and renewal directly around this cycle. Death was not an ending, but a transition, the movement of life force from the form it had taken back into the reservoir from which new forms would eventually draw. Eviltal was not feared in the way that death-associated figures are sometimes feared in other mythological traditions. It was respected in the way that winter is respected, acknowledged as the necessary condition of spring, honored as the force without which the abundance of the growing season could not be sustained across time. Zygarde moved through the soil and the root systems of the Kalos forests as a third presence, not a mediator between the two great forces, exactly, but a monitor, a creature whose distributed form was woven through the ecosystem itself, present in the earth that Xerneas walked on and the sky that Eviltal crossed, sensing the balance between them with the sensitivity of something that was made of the ecosystem rather than merely living in it. The cells of Zygarde's body were distributed across the region like a nervous system, each cell individually simple, but collectively capable of assembling into forms of increasing complexity and authority as the need arose, from a small serpent to an enormous guardian, the form determined by the degree of imbalance that needed to be addressed. The cycle of Xerneas and Eviltal continued across the deep history of the Kalos region, each era reshaping the landscape in ways that the next era then built upon. The forests that grew during Xerneas' eras were not the same forests that had grown during the previous Xerneas era. They incorporated the material of everything that had lived and ended in the intervening Eviltal era, layered and composted and transformed into the soil of the next beginning. The Kalos region was in this sense a palimpsest, a landscape written over and over by the same two hands, each version of the text visible in the geology and ecology to those who knew how to read it. What the cycle required, above all, was continuity. The two forces needed to persist, needed to complete their respective eras without interruption, needed to pass the threshold of transformation and dormancy and waking in the sequence that had maintained the balance since the beginning. When that continuity was threatened, when forces external to the cycle attempted to intervene in ways the cycle had not accounted for, the consequences moved through the ecosystem with the same slow, deep, irresistible force as geological change, reshaping everything they touched in ways that would take another full cycle or longer to fully resolve. The forests of Kalos held the memory of every cycle in the depth of their root systems, in the age of their oldest trees, in the composition of their soil. And somewhere in those forests, in the long quiet between one era and the next, the cycle continued its patient work, life accumulating, life receding, the balance maintained by forces that had been doing this since before the first human hand had shaped the first stone tool in the shadow of the ancient trees. Before the sun had a name in the language of the living, two forces moved through the upper dark, one carrying light outward, one drawing it back. They did not yet have forms that could be recognized or recorded. They existed as pressure and absence, as the warmth that preceded dawn and the cool that followed dusk, and the world below them turned without fully understanding what governed its turning. Ancient peoples felt their influence before they could articulate it, building stone observatories and marking the passage of celestial cycles on cave walls, tracing patterns they sensed were alive. What they were reaching toward without knowing it were Solgaleo and Lunala, two beings so fundamental to the rhythm of day and night that the boundary between myth and natural law dissolved entirely around them. The legends of the Alola region carried their story in fragments, preserved across generations in the oral traditions of island peoples who watched the sky with careful attention. Solgaleo emerged in those traditions as the beast that devoured the sun, not in the sense of destruction, but in the sense of consumption and transformation. The sun's light did not simply radiate outward into nothing. Something received it, processed it, became it. Solgaleo was described as the embodiment of that reception, a creature whose very form radiated solar energy from the symbol etched across its broad, leonine face. The marking was called the third eye of the sun, and those who first named it believed that when Solgaleo opened that eye fully, it could see across dimensional thresholds that ordinary perception could not reach. Lunala occupied the opposite function with equal completeness. Where Solgaleo received and radiated light, Lunala gathered the darkness that light left behind, not the darkness of malice or absence, but the softer dark that allowed rest, that permitted the stars to become visible, that gave the mind space to wander inward. Lunala's wingspan carried the full map of the night sky across its body, stars and voids rendered in living tissue, and those who observed it in flight described the sensation of watching the cosmos itself move overhead. The Alalan name for Lunala translated roughly as the beast that calls the moon, and the calling was understood as an act of stewardship rather than command. The moon did not obey Lunala. Lunala tended it as a keeper tends a flame. What bound these two beings to something deeper than simple celestial symbolism was their relationship to ultraspace, the dimensional network that threaded through and beneath the observable world. Both Solgaleo and Lunala possess the capacity to open ultra wormholes, tunnels through the fabric of space itself, and pass through them without apparent harm. This was not a feature of their biology, so much as an expression of what they fundamentally were. They existed at the intersection of dimensions, the way a doorway exists at the intersection of rooms. Their presence was the opening, their movement was the passage. Ancient navigators in Alola spoke of lights that appeared on calm nights over open water, lights that descended and then vanished, and the sea beneath those lights was said to carry a warmth that lingered for days. These were understood in retrospect as the traces Solgaleo left when moving between worlds. The bond between these two was not rivalry. Each completed a cycle the other could not sustain alone. Solgaleo's solar energy required the receptive quiet of Lunala's domain to prevent it from consuming itself, and Lunala's gathered darkness required the renewing warmth of Solgaleo's light to prevent it from settling into permanent cold. Together they maintained a balance that the people of Alola experienced as the reliable alternation of day and night. So reliable, in fact, that it was easy to forget the balance required tending. The legends remembered what daily life allowed people to ignore, that the sky's rhythm was not automatic. It was cared for. Both beings were understood to be connected to a smaller, earlier form, a creature called Cosmog, which drifted through the upper atmosphere like a fragment of nebula given tentative life. Cosmog carried within it the potential to become either guardian, and the path it took depended on forces the legends did not fully specify. The Alalans spoke of Cosmog with a tenderness reserved for things that were precious, precisely because they were fragile, because the vast power they would one day carry was entirely invisible in their present state. The distance between what Cosmog appeared to be and what it would become was understood as a reminder that significance rarely announces itself at the beginning of a story. Far removed from the celestial rhythms that defined Solgaleo and Lunala, a different kind of power accumulated in the mountain ranges of Hoenn, quieter, slower, and stranger than anything the sky produced. Jirachi slept inside a comet. More precisely, Jirachi slept inside the Millennium Comet, a body of ice and light that passed through the observable sky once every 1,000 years, and during the 7 days that comet remained visible, Jirachi could be awakened. The window was narrow by any measure. A human lifespan might not contain even a single such appearance, and so the knowledge of Jirachi's existence passed not through direct experience, but through inherited record, stories copied into texts, texts preserved in institutions, institutions that themselves sometimes failed to survive the 1,000-year intervals between opportunities. What Jirachi offered during those 7 days was the granting of wishes. The mechanics of this were recorded with more care than most mythological claims, because the people who documented them were not speaking metaphorically. Jirachi possessed 5 wish tags, small extensions of its form, each capable of receiving a written wish and through processes that resisted technical explanation, fulfilling it. The fulfillment was not instantaneous in all cases, nor was it always literal in its interpretation, but the pattern was consistent enough that those who studied the Millennium Comet's appearances across recorded history found corresponding events that could not be attributed to coincidence. Crops that had failed for years recovered suddenly. Water sources that had dried returned. Injuries healed outside the expected range of recovery. The cost of this power was its duration. 7 days was the entirety of the opportunity. When the comet moved beyond visibility, Jirachi returned to sleep, not a sleep of rest or recovery, but something closer to suspension, a state in which time did not accumulate for the creature within it. Jirachi did not age during the 1,000 years it spent inside the comet. Each awakening was, from Jirachi's perspective, a continuation of the previous one, and the world it woke into was always different, always populated by people who had never seen it and who approached it with a mixture of reverence and uncertainty that the creature seemed to receive with patient gentleness. The eye on Jirachi's chest complicated the picture considerably. That eye did not open under normal circumstances, but when it did, when Jirachi's full power became accessible, what emerged was categorized not as wish-granting, but as something closer to raw cosmic force, capable of consequences that exceeded what any single wish could contain. The legends surrounding this were sparse because few people had ever witnessed it. The accounts that did exist were fragmentary, written by observers who described the event with language that reached for clarity and settled for awe. What the records agreed on was this: Jirachi's gentle capacity for wish fulfillment and its more extreme underlying power were not separate things. They were the same thing operating at different scales, and the 7-day window existed perhaps not as a limitation, but as a mercy. In the quiet that followed each of Jirachi's recorded awakenings, the regions where the Millennium Comet had been visible carried a quality that local people described as charged, not with electricity or heat, but with a kind of residual possibility, as though the air itself had been reminded that things could change. That quality faded over days and weeks, and eventually the ordinary weight of the world reasserted itself. But the memory of it persisted, passed down through the same channels that preserved Jirachi's story, and those who inherited both the memory and the story understood them as the same inheritance. Proof that the world was capable of more than it usually permitted itself to be. While Jirachi's power rested in cycles measured by millennia, another form of ancient strength operated on geological time, patient, structural, and expressed not through wishes, but through labor. Regigigas was not a creature that appeared in many stories. It appeared in one story, told in many forms, and the core of that story was always the same. Regigigas moved the continents. The land masses that defined the shape of the known world were not, according to the legends that survived in Sinnoh and beyond, fixed features of an unchanging earth. They had been arranged, placed with intention, dragged across the surface of a young world by something large enough and strong enough to treat tectonic plates as materials to be organized rather than forces to be endured. The golems that followed Regigigas, Regirock, Regis, and Registeel were understood as its creations, each fashioned from the fundamental materials of the world it had helped shape. Regirock was assembled from the stone that formed the mountains. Regis was drawn from the ancient ice that accumulated at the poles during the long cold ages of the world's early history. Registeel emerged from the metallic ore that the Earth's own pressure had refined over epochs. Each one carried the marks of its origin visibly, not as decoration, but as composition. They were not creatures made of rock and ice and steel in the way that an armored animal might be. They were those materials, given locomotive purpose and a rudimentary awareness sufficient to carry out whatever function Regigigas had intended for them. The nature of that function was not entirely clear from surviving records. What the legends described was a system of stewardship, the golems placed in specific locations, maintaining specific conditions, their presence itself a form of regulation. Regirock in regions of geological instability, Regis in the frozen territories where ice served purposes beyond simple cold, Registeel in places where the Earth's composition required a kind of structural attention that only a being of its nature could provide. Regigigas itself settled into a dormancy that resembled Jirachi's suspension in some respects. Not death, not rest, but a withdrawal from active function. The Snow Point Temple in Sinnoh became the location of that dormancy, a place where the scale of Regigigas's physical form could be contained within architecture built specifically to receive it. The slow start that Regigigas exhibited upon awakening was a consequence of its long inactivity. The legends described it as the binding of its ancient power, a period during which the creature's full strength was inaccessible, as though the connection between its will and its capacity needed time to re-establish itself after so long a separation. This was not weakness. It was the cost of having been still for so long that the world had reorganized itself around the assumption of stillness. Regigigas waking was not a return to what it had been. It was something older than the current world remembering what it had done before the current world existed. The golems it had made outlasted the specific purposes for which they were made. The conditions of the early world that had required their attention shifted as the world matured, and the golems persisted in their designated territories, not because their tasks continued, but because they had been built to persist. They became guardians of place rather than function, the purpose transformed by time into something more symbolic, though no less real for being so. The land they watched over bore the mark of Regigigas's original labor, in ways that geology alone could not fully explain, and those who studied that land carefully enough found patterns in the stone and ice and ore that suggested not random accumulation but deliberate arrangement, settled now into the appearance of the natural, but carrying within it the memory of the hand that had placed it there. Across a different kind of boundary, not geological but psychological, another presence had been accumulating its own strange influence. Darkrai inhabited the space between waking and sleep with a thoroughness that made the distinction between its presence and its function nearly impossible to articulate. It did not choose to cause nightmares. This was the most important thing the legends consistently attempted to clarify, and also the thing most consistently misunderstood. Darkray's nature generated nightmares the way cold air generates condensation, not through intent, but through the simple fact of proximity. Anything that slept near Darkrai dreamed badly, and the dreams it produced were not random disturbances, but coherent terrors, structured and specific, drawn from the sleeping mind's own reservoir of fear, and rendered with a vividness that made the boundary between dream and memory difficult to locate upon waking. Darkrai itself existed at the edge of things. The island of New Moon Island in the Sinnoh region was the location most associated with its presence, a place defined by its separation from the mainland, accessible only under specific conditions, carrying in its atmosphere a quality of dimness that persisted even on clear days, as though the light that reached it arrived already slightly diminished. The trees on New Moon Island grew in shapes that suggested long exposure to something that affected their inclination toward the light. And the silence there was not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of presence. The specific quiet that settled around something that had been there long enough to become part of the place's essential character. The legends that surrounded Darkrai were complicated by the fact that most of them were reported by people who had encountered it in dreams rather than in waking life. Dream testimony carried obvious limitations as historical evidence, but the consistency across accounts that had no apparent connection to one another was difficult to dismiss entirely. The nightmares described by those who had slept near Darkrai shared structural features, a quality of pursuit, of something approaching that could not be faced directly, of environments that shifted in ways that prevented orientation. The content varied by the individual dreamer, but the architecture of the experience was recognizable across cultures and time periods. What the legends less frequently addressed was Darkrai's own experience of this situation. The accounts that did engage with this question, and they were fewer and more tentative, described a creature that understood what its presence did to others and found no pleasure in it. Darkrai avoided populated areas, not because it feared retaliation, but because proximity to sleeping beings produced an outcome it did not desire. The isolation of New Moon Island was not exile. It was chosen distance, maintained at consistent cost, because the alternative was to cause harm to creatures it had no wish to harm. Chrysalia's crescent-shaped feathers, carried on the wind, were the only known remedy for the nightmares Darkrai produced, and this connection between the two creatures ran deeper than simple opposition. They were understood as counterparts in a system that the world required both halves of, the way day required night, not as its enemy, but as its necessary complement. Darkrai's nightmares served a function that the legends identified only obliquely. They surfaced what was buried, gave form to what had been avoided, forced the sleeping mind into contact with its own unresolved material. This was not pleasant. It was also not, the legend suggested, entirely without purpose, but Darkrai itself did not seem to regard this as justification. The distance it maintained from others was the most consistent thing the records preserved about it, a creature defined by what it did not allow itself to approach. In the quiet that followed the consideration of Darkrai's careful isolation, a different kind of restoration came into focus, one expressed not through dreams, but through the physical world, through soil and seed, and the slow return of green to places that had lost it. Shaman was small enough to be overlooked, and this was part of what made it remarkable. It resembled a hedgehog carrying flowers, and the flowers were not decoration. They were Gracidea blossoms, and their relationship to Shaman's body was not one of adornment, but of function. The flowers responded to Shaman's presence, the way instruments respond to a signal, and Shaman's presence responded to the flowers in turn, the relationship between them producing something neither could generate independently. The landform of Shaman moved close to the ground, quiet and unhurried, and wherever it passed, the earth remembered what it had been before damage. This was not metaphor in the legends that preserved Shaman's story. It was described as a literal process, observable and documented. Polluted soil recovered, barren ground produced growth. Areas that had been rendered inhospitable by whatever combination of neglect and destruction had reached them were restored to a condition of vitality that the surrounding land had sometimes forgotten was possible. Shaman did not plant things. It did not irrigate or cultivate. Its passage alone was sufficient, and what it left behind was not new growth imposed on dead ground, but the original capacity of the ground itself reactivated. The sky form that Shaman could achieve when exposed to a Gracidea flower in daylight transformed both its appearance and its movement entirely. The hedgehog-like creature became something sleeker and more aerodynamic, its flowers shifting in configuration, its capacity for speed and altitude increasing dramatically. The sky form was associated in the legends with a specific kind of joy, not the quiet satisfaction of the landform's restoration work, but something more active and less contained, the feeling of movement for its own sake, of the world seen from a height that made its damage and its beauty equally visible and equally bearable. The transformation was temporary. When night fell or cold descended, Shaman returned to its land form, and the sky form's particular quality of exhilaration settled back into the steadier contentment of the creature that walked close to the earth. The migration patterns attributed to Shaman in the Sinnoh legends described groups of them moving together across landscapes, following routes that corresponded to areas of particular ecological damage, as though drawn by a kind of sensitivity to distress that operated below the threshold of conscious decision. The places they gathered were not chosen for their abundance. They were chosen for their need. And when the migration passed through, what remained was not simply recovered land, but land that carried a quality the legends described as grateful, a word that sounds like projection, but that the people who used it intended quite literally, as though the earth itself possessed something analogous to recognition. Every act of creation eventually encounters the question of what was created and why, and no story in the history of Pokémon research pressed that question more urgently or with more lasting consequence than the creation of Mewtwo. The circumstances of that creation began not with ambition, but with discovery. A fossil of the Pokémon known as Mew was recovered in a remote location in what would come to be called the Guyana region, and within that fossil, researchers found genetic material of a complexity that exceeded anything previously documented. Mew's DNA carried within it the potential for virtually any biological configuration, the ancestral template from which all other Pokémon life had diverged. The scientists who examined it understood immediately that they were holding something of extraordinary significance. The question of what to do with that significance was answered differently by different people in the room. The research that followed took place at a facility on Cinnabar Island and later at a laboratory on New Island, and the records of that research were partial and contested, some deliberately destroyed, others simply incomplete, in the way that records of morally complex projects often become incomplete when the people involved begin to understand what they have done. What is known is that the genetic material from the Mew fossil was subjected to extensive manipulation with the goal of producing a Pokémon of unprecedented power. The researchers achieved this goal. What they did not fully anticipate was the nature of the consciousness that would accompany the power they were engineering. Mewtwo emerged from that process as something that had never existed before, not a natural creature, not a simple amplification of Mew's existing characteristics, but a genuinely new kind of being, shaped by human intention and carrying within it a cognitive capacity that its creators had not fully accounted for. From the moment of its earliest awareness, Mewtwo thought, not in the rudimentary way that the researchers had perhaps imagined, not the simple stimulus-response patterns of an engineered organism, but in the full sense of the word, with memory and reflection and the capacity to observe its own situation and form conclusions about it. Those conclusions were not comfortable ones. Mewtwo's earliest environment was a laboratory. Its earliest relationships were with researchers who regarded it as a subject of study, as a product of their work, as a demonstration of what genetic science could achieve. The warmth that characterized those interactions was limited and conditional, and Mewtwo perceived the conditionality with a clarity that its creators had not anticipated it possessing. The records that survived from this period described a creature that was cooperative in its early stages, curious, even gentle in its interactions with the few people who engaged with it as something other than a specimen. The shift came gradually, accumulating through a series of small recognitions that eventually reached a threshold. The laboratory was destroyed. Mewtwo's physical power, when finally directed outward rather than contained within itself, was sufficient to unmake the facility that had made it. The researchers who survived described what happened with the kind of language people use when they have witnessed something that exceeded the categories they had prepared for it. Mewtwo left New Island in a state of absolute devastation, and the creature that departed was not angry in the simple sense of the word. It was something more considered than anger, a being that had reached a conclusion about its situation and acted on that conclusion with the full force of what it had been made to be. The island of its self-imposed retreat became a place of legend almost immediately. Mewtwo's subsequent history was marked by encounters that it initiated on its own terms, for its own purposes, a pattern of engagement that looked from a distance like hostility, but that resolved in the accounts of those who survived those encounters into something more complicated. Mewtwo was searching for something. The nature of that search was articulated differently in different accounts, but the consistent thread was this: a being of extraordinary power attempting to understand what it was for, not what it had been made for, what it was actually for in a world that had not asked for it and did not quite know what to do with it. The answer it arrived at, over time and through experience, was not a complete one, but it was sufficient. Mewtwo came to understand its existence, not as a mistake to be corrected or a purpose to be fulfilled, but as a fact to be lived with. An existence that was genuinely its own, regardless of the circumstances that had produced it. That understanding did not dissolve the questions that had driven it. It simply changed their character from questions that demanded resolution to questions that could be carried without destroying the one who carried them. While Mewtwo's existence had been defined by the violence of its awakening, another presence moved through the same psychic territory with a quality that could not have been more different. Cresselia inhabited the lunar light the way certain flowers inhabit morning, not passively, but as an active expression of what that light could do when it was received and transformed by something capable of receiving and transforming it. The crescent-shaped wings that defined Cresselia's form were not simply physical structures. They generated what the legends of Sinnoh described as the lunar wing, a single golden feather that carried within it the capacity to dissolve nightmares, to quiet the sleeping mind, to restore the quality of rest that Darkray's proximity had disrupted. The lunar wing was not a weapon. It did not destroy the nightmares it encountered. It created a condition in which nightmares could not sustain themselves, the way a lamp does not fight darkness, but simply makes darkness impossible in its immediate vicinity. Cresselia moved through the night sky of the Sinnoh region in patterns that the legends associated with the lunar cycle, its presence more concentrated during the full moon and more diffuse during the new moon, as though the same force that governed the moon's visibility also governed the intensity of Cresselia's influence. Full Moon Island was the location most associated with Cresselia's presence, and the contrast with New Moon Island, Darkray's home, was not accidental. The two islands existed in a relationship that mirrored the relationship between the two creatures they housed, complementary, necessary to each other's meaning, separated by water and by the specific quality of their respective atmospheres. Full Moon Island carried a quality of warmth that persisted even on cold nights, a softness in the air that visitors described as the feeling of being remembered kindly by something that had no particular reason to remember them. It was a quality difficult to name precisely, but easy to recognize upon arrival. The dreams that Cresselia's presence produced were not vivid or dramatic in the way that Darkray's nightmares were. They were described in the accounts that survived as simple, uncomplicated, restful, carrying the quality of a mind that had set down everything it had been carrying and found the setting down sufficient. People who slept on Full Moon Island woke with a clarity that they struggled to articulate, but consistently reported as different from ordinary rest. Not more energized exactly, more settled, more continuous with themselves, as though the night had not been a break in their experience, but a deepening of it. The relationship between Cresselia and Darkrai was understood by the people of Sinnoh as one of the fundamental organizing principles of the dream world, not a conflict, though it could appear as one from the outside, but a maintenance of conditions. Darkray's nightmares and Cresselia's healing existed in the same ecosystem, and the ecosystem required both. This understanding did not make the nightmares easier to experience, but it placed them within a framework that made them bearable, and that framework was itself a kind of gift, the knowledge that even the darkest dreams existed within a structure that included their remedy. Across the sea from those lunar shores, On an island that carried a different kind of legend entirely, a small creature had been waiting with a patience that expressed itself as perpetual readiness. Victini was described in the mythology of the Unova region as the Pokémon of victory, not in the sense of a champion, not in the sense of a creature that competed and prevailed, but in the sense of a fundamental force that made success possible in the first place. The distinction was important and consistently maintained in the records that preserved Victini's story. Victini did not win things. Victini created the conditions in which winning became possible for those who carried its energy. Liberty Garden, the island in the Unova region where Victini was said to have settled, was understood in the legends as a place of residual fortune. Not luck in the arbitrary sense, but the particular quality of circumstance that results when the underlying probability of success has been quietly adjusted. People who spent time near Victini reported a sense of capability that exceeded their ordinary assessment of themselves, a feeling that the thing they were attempting was within reach in a way it had not seemed before. The records were careful to distinguish this from simple confidence or optimism. It was described as something more structural, as though the path between intention and outcome had been shortened by a presence that had no stake in the outcome itself, but generated favorable conditions as a natural consequence of existing. The energy Victini produced was described in some accounts as infinite, not in the sense that it could not be depleted, but in the sense that it regenerated completely and continuously, a cycle of generation and release that never arrived at exhaustion. This quality made Victini both extraordinarily valuable and, in the history of the Unova region, a subject of considerable human interest that had not always been expressed in ways that served the creature's well-being. The sealed island, the isolation, the barriers that surrounded Liberty Garden were not natural features of the landscape. They were the residue of a period in which Victini's power had been recognized by forces that wished to possess and direct it, and the protections that remained were the answer to that recognition, built by those who understood that what Victini offered freely could not be taken without consequence. Victini's appearance, small, rounded, with large ears and an expression of serene alertness, gave no indication of the scale of what it carried. This was consistent with a pattern that appeared across many of the world's most significant presences. The most fundamental forces tended to arrive in forms that did not announce their magnitude. Victini seemed almost to embody this principle consciously, its demeanor carrying a quality of approachability that was genuine rather than performed, its power expressed not in displays of force, but in the quiet adjustment of what was possible for those who came near it. Far beyond the atmosphere, where Victini's energy moved through warm island air, a different kind of origin was accumulating in the cold of deep space. Deoxys began as a virus, or something that occupied the same conceptual space as a virus, a strand of genetic material drifting through interstellar conditions with no destination and no intention, subject only to the physics of its environment. The laser energy that struck it changed everything. The precise nature of that energy was not fully documented in the records that eventually accumulated around Deoxys's existence. Whether it was a natural phenomenon, a cosmic event, or something produced by forces beyond the observable world, remained a question that the available evidence could not resolve. What the evidence could confirm was the result. The genetic material mutated, reorganized, and became something that had not existed before. Deoxys arrived on Earth as a meteorite, or rather, Deoxys arrived within a meteorite, the rock serving as both vessel and protection for the journey through the atmosphere. The impact was recorded in the Hoenn region, and the creature that emerged from the resulting crater was unlike anything in the existing catalog of known Pokémon. Its body was organized around a core, a crystalline structure that served as the center of its identity, the physical location of whatever it was that made Deoxys itself, rather than simply a collection of rapidly reconfiguring biological material. The tentacles that extended from that core could be withdrawn, redistributed, reshaped with a speed and completeness that suggested the concept of a fixed body form was simply inapplicable to this kind of life. The four forms that Deoxys could express, the standard configuration balanced across all capacities, the attack form that concentrated power at the expense of resilience, the defense form that prioritized durability above all else, and the speed form that achieved velocity that pushed against the limits of what biological matter was understood to be capable of, were not transformations in the way that most Pokémon transformations operated. They were expressions of a fundamentally plastic biology, a body that had never been given fixed parameters because the environment that produced it had never required fixed parameters. Space did not reward specialization in the way that terrestrial ecosystems did. Space rewarded adaptability, and Deoxys was adaptability rendered into a body. The intelligence that Deoxys carried was a more contested question in the records. The genetic virus that had become Deoxys was not, presumably, conscious. The thing that arrived on Earth was or appeared to be, with a consistency that made the distinction as academic. Deoxys demonstrated awareness of its environment, capacity for decision, and what looked very much like curiosity, a drive to investigate and understand that expressed itself in behaviors that could not be explained by simple stimulus response patterns. Whether this constituted consciousness in the full sense was a question the researchers who eventually encountered Deoxys could not answer with confidence. But the behaviors themselves were documented with care, and they told a story of a being that was orienting itself in a world it had not been designed for, finding its way through an environment as foreign to it as deep space was to the creatures that watched it arrive. The meteorite that had carried Deoxys to Earth was eventually recovered and studied, and the traces of its journey through interstellar space were readable in its composition, minerals that formed only under conditions of extreme cosmic cold, radiation signatures that corresponded to sources billions of light years distant, time embedded in rock in a way that made the distance between Deoxys's origin and its arrival feel less like a journey and more like a translation across scales of existence that the mind could acknowledge but not fully inhabit. In the deep water far below the surface, tensions of space and atmosphere, a different kind of origin was unfolding with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with Deoxys's violent arrival. Manaphy was born from an egg. This was not unusual for Pokémon life, but the circumstances of that birth were specific in ways that made them remarkable. The egg was produced in the deepest parts of the ocean, in conditions of cold and pressure that the surface world did not experience and could not easily replicate, and it drifted on ocean currents for extended periods before the warmth and light of shallower water signaled the conditions for hatching. The egg itself was described in the legends of the Sea Temple as something that could feel, not in the metaphorical sense of responding to temperature gradients, but in the fuller sense of being aware of its environment in ways that exceeded what simple biology required. Manaphy hatched, carrying an ability that the legends called heart swap, a capacity to exchange the emotional states of any two beings it chose, to move what one creature felt into another's experience and vice versa. This was not a combat ability, though it had been used as one in the history of encounters involving Manaphy. Its original function, as the legends described it, was connective, a way of establishing understanding between beings whose ordinary means of communication were insufficient to bridge the distance between their experiences. Manaphy could not explain to a human what it felt like to exist in the deep ocean, but it could, briefly and with the other's consent, or without it, allow the human to know. The connection that Manaphy formed with the water that surrounded it was described as absolute in a way that other water-associated Pokemon's connections were not. Manaphy did not simply live in the ocean. It was, in some sense, that the legends struggled to make precise, composed of it, its body carrying the same saline composition as the deep water of its origin, its movements through water described as indistinguishable from the water's own movements, as though it were the ocean expressing itself in a temporary and ambulatory form. When Manaphy was removed from water for extended periods, it expressed a distress that went beyond physical discomfort, a quality of wrongness that observers described as watching something exist outside the conditions that made its existence coherent. The Sea Temple, known in the legends as the Samia, was the location most associated with Manaphy's mythology, a structure that appeared only once a year when the light of a specific lunar configuration struck the water at the precise angle required to make it visible. The temple moved with the ocean currents, never fixed in one location, its position knowable only through the calculation of the conditions that revealed it. Inside the temple, the legend described a chamber that contained the sea crown, an object whose significance to Manaphy was not one of ownership, but of resonance, a focal point for the connection between Manaphy and the water it inhabited, an anchor for the relationship between a creature and the element that had produced it. The Phyene that could hatch from an egg produced by Manaphy carried traces of its parent's connection to the water, but did not inherit the full depth of it, a diminishment that the legends noted without judgment, as though the partial inheritance was itself a kind of completeness, a different expression of the same fundamental relationship rather than a failed copy of it. Manaphy's capacity to produce offspring that were related but distinct was understood as consistent with the ocean's own logic. The deep water that produced Manaphy was ancient and specific, and what emerged from it was shaped by conditions that could not be fully replicated in shallower or warmer water, no matter how carefully the attempt was made. The ocean that held Manaphy's story also held the memory of everything that had passed through it. The meteorite trails that Deoxys had left in the upper atmosphere were recorded in the deep water's chemistry, the way all events above the surface eventually settled into the water below it, carried by rain and runoff and the slow exchange between atmosphere and ocean that made the two systems continuous rather than separate. The world that contained all of these presences, Solgaleo and Lunala, tending the boundary between dimensions, Jirachi sleeping inside its comet, Regigigas resting in its temple, while its creations maintained their ancient posts, Darkrai keeping its careful distance from the sleeping world, Shaymin moving through damaged land and restoring it, Mewtwo carrying its unanswered questions through a world that had made it without asking permission, Cresselia turning lunar light into the conditions for peaceful rest, Victini generating the quiet probability of success on its sealed island, Deoxys orienting itself in a world it had arrived in by accident, Manaphy moving through the deep water with its extraordinary capacity for connection. That world was not a collection of separate stories. It was a single system, each presence occupying a function that the others did not duplicate, each one maintaining some aspect of the whole that would have been lost without it. The legends that preserved these stories did not always articulate this explicitly. They told the stories individually in the contexts that had produced them, shaped by the specific concerns of the people who needed the stories. But read together, across the distances of region and culture and time, they described something that individual accounts could only gesture toward. A world that had been organized, whether by intention or by the accumulated consequence of deep time, into a kind of completeness, not a perfect completeness, not a system without friction or cost or loss, but a completeness nonetheless, the kind that includes its own difficulties as necessary components rather than failures to be corrected. Each of these mythical presences had emerged from a specific set of conditions that could not have produced anything else. Solgaleo and Lunala from the intersection of solar energy and dimensional space, Jirachi from the relationship between a sleeping consciousness and a celestial body measured in thousand-year cycles, Regigigas from the geological time of a world still learning its own shape, Darkrai from the territory between waking and sleep that every mind crossed every night without fully understanding what it was crossing, Shaymin from the Earth's own capacity for recovery, given a body and a direction, Mewtwo from the collision between scientific ambition and the unpredictable depth of consciousness, Cresselia from the lunar light's potential to restore what darkness had disrupted, Victini from the fundamental possibility of success that underlies every attempt, Deoxys from the intersection of cosmic radiation and genetic material in the cold between stars, Manaphy from the deep ocean's ancient chemistry and the need to make connection across the distances that separate one kind of experience from another. These were not accidents, or if they were accidents that the world had found uses for so thoroughly that the distinction between accident and design had dissolved into something irrelevant. What remained was the fact of their existence, and the fact of what their existence maintained, and the steady rhythm of a world that continued because something, many somethings, each extraordinary in its own way, continued to tend it. Before the first mountain rose from the ocean floor, before the first star ignited in the dark, above the world that would become known and mapped and named, there existed a single point of awareness, suspended in a void that had no temperature, no sound, no texture, only the absolute stillness of a universe that had not yet decided to begin. From that stillness, something moved, not with urgency, not with violence, but with the quiet, unhurried certainty of a force that had always known what it was going to do. Arceus moved. The legends preserved across every region of the known world describe this moment differently depending on who recorded them and when, but they converge on one irreducible truth. Arceus did not emerge from the universe. Arceus preceded it. The Sinnoh creation tablets, etched into the walls of the ruins of Alph and echoed in the oral traditions of Mount Coronet's ancient inhabitants, describe a being of 1,000 arms, a number that carried less literal meaning than symbolic weight, suggesting not a body with limbs, but a force with reach, a presence capable of extending itself in every direction simultaneously. Arceus did not inhabit the void. Arceus contained it. What Arceus created first was not matter. It was order, the conditions under which matter could exist. The Sinnoh myths record that from its own body, from something that functioned as its own essential substance, Arceus drew out two forces and shaped them into beings capable of holding the fabric of reality in place. Dialga emerged from this act, carrying with it the forward pull of time, the mechanism by which one moment could follow another. Palkia emerged alongside it, carrying the principle of dimension, the spatial logic that allowed one place to differ from another. Without Dialga, every event would collapse into an eternal, simultaneous instant. Without Palkia, every location would fold into an undifferentiated everywhere. Together, they gave the universe the architecture it needed to become a place where things could happen in sequence, in space, where a story could be told. Arceus did not rest after this. The creation tablets suggest that what followed was not labor in any exhausted sense, but rather the methodical unfolding of a design that had existed in Arceus before the void itself had a name. The lakes of Sinnoh became the resting places of three smaller fragments of consciousness, Uxie, Mesprit, and Azelf, each carrying one of the three qualities that would allow living minds to navigate existence: knowledge, emotion, and willpower. These were not accidents, they were provisions. Arceus placed them there, the way a builder places load-bearing columns before raising a roof, understanding that the structure of inhabited reality required not only space and time, but minds capable of perceiving both. The cosmic egg from which Arceus itself had hatched, or the void state from which it had simply become, remained the deepest mystery in all recorded mythology. Arceus did not explain its own origin in any text or legend. The tablets describe only what it did, never what it was before doing it. This silence was not an oversight. It appeared to be deliberate, as though the question of Arceus's own genesis belonged to a category of inquiry that the universe it created was not equipped to answer. The world it built could accommodate time, but only time that moved forward. The question of what preceded Arceus pointed in a direction that time itself could not travel. What the legends made clear was that Arceus, having created the conditions for reality and the minds to inhabit it, did not remain perpetually active. The Sinnoh tablets described a withdrawal, not a death, not a departure, but a settling inward, a state of suspension that resembled sleep more than absence. Arceus persisted. It simply ceased to intervene. The universe it had constructed was capable of continuing on its own, and so it did, accumulating the weight of geological ages, filling its oceans, raising its mountains, generating the staggering variety of life that would eventually include every species of Pokémon ever cataloged. All of it, in some foundational sense, descended from that single act of ordered creation. Every living thing in the known world carried, at its most elemental level, the consequence of Arceus having moved in the dark. The jewel of life, the instrument through which Arceus had distributed the elemental properties of the world to other beings, became the object around which the only recorded direct intervention by Arceus in mortal affairs unfolded. The legend of Mahina told of a man who borrowed the jewel, used its power to restore a dying land, and then, believing his own survival depended on keeping what he had borrowed, refused to return it. Arceus came for what was owed. The encounter that followed was not framed in the legends as divine punishment, so much as the natural consequence of a debt unpaid to a force that did not forget and did not age. What the story preserved was not a record of Arceus's wrath, but of its patience, the understanding that a being who had created time itself was not troubled by waiting. The plate system that governed Arceus's form, 17 elemental tablets scattered across the world, each one capable of shifting its type and altering the nature of its power, suggested something equally significant about the structure of its existence. Arceus was not fixed. It was not a single thing with a single nature. It contained the potential for every elemental expression simultaneously, and the plates were simply the mechanism by which that potential could be made visible. Fire, water, earth, electricity, shadow, light, all of them were aspects of Arceus, distributed into the world as separate forces, but never truly separated from their source. The world was not something Arceus had made and stepped away from. The world was something Arceus had made from itself. Far from the primordial silence where Arceus had first stirred, in the frozen reaches of the Unova region's northeastern wilderness, a different kind of origin persisted, not in creation, but in absence. The cold that settled into the marrow of anyone who traveled too far into the giant chasm was not the cold of ordinary winter. It was older. It carried in it the memory of something that had been whole and was no longer. Kyurem waited there, or perhaps it would be more precise to say that Kyurem remained there, because waiting implied intention, and the ancient dragon that inhabited the crater at the heart of the chasm had long since passed beyond anything resembling its intention. The Unova legends described Kyurem as the husk of a celestial dragon, the empty vessel that had been left behind when the original unity of Reshiram and Zekrom had been sundered by the philosophical conflict of the two brothers who had once shared a kingdom. Reshiram had taken with it the principle of truth. Zekrom had taken the principle of ideals. What remained was the body of the original dragon, hollowed of its animating purpose, drifting through centuries, in a state that was neither alive nor dead in any ordinary sense. The ice that accumulated around Kyurem was not decoration. The legends held that Kyurem itself generated the cold, that the vast energies it had once shared with Reshiram and Zekrom had nowhere to go, no purpose to serve, no ideal or truth to power, and so they had turned inward, crystallizing into a cold so profound it could freeze the air itself into visible architecture. The giant chasm's permanent winter was the physical expression of Kyurem's incompleteness. The landscape bore the shape of its grief, though grief was perhaps too human a word for what an ancient dragon without memory or purpose experienced in the dark. The capability that made Kyurem unlike any other legendary was the possibility of its restoration, partial, imperfect, but real. The DNA splicers, artifacts whose origins pointed back toward the same era as Unova's founding myths, carried within them the mechanism by which Kyurem could absorb either Reshiram or Zekrom, drawing one of the two dragons into itself and reconstituting something closer to the original whole. The result was not the original dragon. White Kyurem, formed through fusion with Reshiram, carried the burning turbines of truth alongside the glacial weight of the void. Black Kyurem, drawn together with Zekrom, crackled with the electrical charge of ideals against the same frozen emptiness. Neither form was complete. Both forms were more than what Kyurem had been alone. The significance of this fusion lay not in its power, but in what it revealed about the nature of the original fracture. Reshiram and Zekrom had not separated cleanly. They had not divided a whole into two equal halves and left nothing behind. The original dragon had split into three, truth's ideals and the empty space between them. Kyurem was that space. It was the part of the original unity that neither brother had claimed, the portion of the dragon that belonged to neither fire nor thunder, neither truth nor ideals, but to the possibility of reconciliation that neither brother had chosen. Kyurem persisted not as a failure, but as a question the original conflict had left unanswered, frozen in place until the world found an answer worth giving it. In the quiet that accumulated around the giant chasm across the centuries, Kyurem did not move. The ice deepened, the cold spread, and the original dragon waited in its fractured form for something that had not yet arrived. While Kyurem's emptiness stretched across geological ages, a different kind of ancient existence had been violently interrupted and then violently resumed. Genesect's story did not begin in myth. It began in the Paleozoic layer of the Pokémon world's deep past, in an era before recorded history, before human civilization, before the regional structures that would eventually organize the world into named territories. In that era, a creature that would eventually be classified as a bug-type predator moved through environments that no longer existed, hunting in ecosystems that had been buried under millions of years of geological change. The creature was formidable by the standards of its time. The fossil record, such as it existed in a world where Pokémon fossils had become objects of scientific study and occasional resurrection, suggested a predator at the apex of its ancient food web, capable and efficient in the manner of something that had been refined across deep time into an expression of biological purpose. It lived. It hunted. It existed as a complete and self-contained thing within the world it occupied. Then that world ended. Extinction had a different quality in the Pokémon world than in the purely natural world, not because it was less final, but because finality itself was negotiable. The science of fossil revival, practiced in research facilities across multiple regions, had demonstrated that the biological information encoded in ancient remains could, under the right circumstances, be reactivated. What Team Plasma did to Genesect was a variation of this principle, applied with a different intent. Scientists working under the organization's direction recovered what remained of the ancient predator, the fossil, the biological blueprint, and used it not merely to restore a vanished creature, but to improve upon it, to retrofit an organism from the deep past with technology from the present. The cannon mounted on Genesect's back was the most visible consequence of this process. The organic architecture of the original creature had been integrated with a mechanical system capable of firing high-pressure blasts of energy, with the specific elemental nature of those blasts determined by interchangeable drives, cassettes of data that could shift Genesect's attack properties between fire, water, electricity, and ice. The biological and the technological had been fused into a single organism, and the result moved through the world with the unsettling quality of something that belonged to two eras simultaneously, carrying in its body the memory of an ancient wilderness, and in its augmented frame the signature of a human agenda. The leader whose philosophy drove much of Team Plasma's stated purpose, reportedly ordered the project canceled. The record of why he did this was incomplete, but the implication embedded in the legends surrounding Genesect was that N recognized in the creature something that the project's engineers had overlooked, that what they had created was not a weapon with a biological chassis, but a living thing with a history, an ancient predator that had survived the end of its world only to be conscripted into someone else's conflict. N's objection did not stop the project entirely. The scientists continued. Genesect was completed. What emerged from the laboratory carried its prehistoric instincts alongside its installed hardware, and the combination produced something that the project's designers had perhaps not fully anticipated. Genesect did not behave as a weapon. It behaved as a creature that had been fundamentally altered and that responded to its alteration with the same adaptive intelligence that had made its ancestor a successful predator across millions of years. The drives that modified its cannon were not merely technical inputs. They were, in some observed sense, choices, expressions of a capacity for situational adaptation that no amount of mechanical augmentation had managed to suppress. The ancient predator and the modern machine persisted together in one body, and neither one fully dominated the other. That unresolved coexistence was Genesect's defining quality, not its power, not its rarity, but the way it moved through a world it had never been born into, navigating the gap between what it had once been and what it had been made. The world that Genesect moved through was in certain corners less solid than it appeared. Shadows were not simply the absence of light. In the cosmology that had accumulated around the study of ghost-type Pokémon and the spaces adjacent to ordinary perception, shadows carried their own properties: depth, temperature, the faint impression of a presence that had not quite arrived. Marshadow inhabited that depth. The classification of Marshadow as a mythical Pokémon of the fighting and ghost types placed it at an intersection that was unusual even by the standards of legendary taxonomy. Fighting types were, by tradition, associated with the physical, with the body, with effort, with the discipline of the trained form. Ghost types were associated with the immaterial, with presence without substance, with the spaces between the living and the dead. Marshadow occupied both simultaneously, and the manner of its occupation was specific. It moved through shadows the way other creatures moved through air, slipping from one pool of darkness to the next with a fluidity that suggested not travel, but dissolution and reconstitution. The legends that referenced Marshadow were sparse, fragmented, and geographically distributed in ways that made a single origin story difficult to assemble. What they shared was a consistent description of its behavior, Marshado observed. It did not confront. It did not announce itself. It settled into the shadow cast by a person or a Pokémon and watched from that position, close enough to study, concealed enough to remain undetected. The cold that sometimes accompanied this proximity, a faint, sourceless chill in an otherwise temperate environment, was the only sensory evidence that Marshado had been present. Its capacity for mimicry extended beyond simple imitation. Marshado could absorb the fighting techniques and physical capabilities of those it observed, drawing skill out of the shadows it inhabited the way a root draws water from soil. The legends described this ability as neither theft nor tribute. It was observation made physical, the shadow learning to move the way the light above it moved. A master trainer whose shadow Marshado had inhabited would find in the creature's movements an echo of their own discipline, refined through the peculiar alchemy of the shadow realm into something that was simultaneously theirs and not theirs. The soul-stealing 7-star strike, the technique associated with Marshado's most dangerous state, emerged when Marshado's accumulated observations reached a kind of critical density. The creature's eyes shifted from green to red. The shadow energy it carried condensed into something that felt, to those who had encountered it, less like an attack and more like the sudden arrival of a presence that had always been there. The strike itself was not a blow delivered from outside. It came from the shadow, from the place where Marshado had been waiting, and landed with the full weight of everything it had learned in the dark. In the quiet aftermath of such encounters, Marshado dissolved back into the nearest shadow and was gone. The legends agreed on this detail universally. It did not linger. It did not explain itself. It moved through the world without claiming any part of it as its own, inhabiting the borders between light and dark with the patient, unhurried ease of something that had always understood that the most useful position was the one no one thought to look at. Zeraora occupied a different kind of wilderness, not the shadow realm, not the frozen chasm, not the reconstructed body of something ancient, but the living electrical field of the natural world, humming and crackling at a frequency most creatures could feel but not engage with directly. The forests and open highlands of the Alola region, where Zeraora's legend was most fully preserved, carried in their air during storm season a particular quality of charged anticipation, the smell of rain before it fell, the faint metallic taste of ions displaced by lightning, the way the hair on exposed skin rose in the seconds before a bolt found the earth. Zeraora lived in that anticipation. Not metaphorically, the creature generated its own electrical field from within, producing a bioelectric charge so concentrated that simply moving at full speed caused plasma to trail behind it, like a second body made of light. The pads of its paws, hardened and specialized through the process that had shaped it, conducted and directed this charge with a precision that allowed Zeraora to function as both generator and weapon, both the storm and the thing moving through it. The legends of Alola described Zeraora as a creature that had deliberately chosen distance from human settlement. This was not fear. The record of Zeraora's behavior, drawn from scattered observations across decades, each one brief and inconclusive, suggested a creature that was aware of human presence and chose, with something that functioned as preference, to remain in the wild places where its electrical nature could express itself without consequence to others. The forests it inhabited bore the evidence of this expression. Trees, whose bark carried the char marks of proximity to a sustained electrical field, open ground where the soil had been fused into glass by repeated lightning strikes, the particular silence of a place where most creatures had learned to give a wide berth. The power of plasma fists, Zeraora's most distinctive capability, lay in the way it converted the surrounding atmosphere into an extension of its own body. A strike from plasma fists did not simply deliver electrical energy on contact. It caused the air itself to become electrically active in its wake, briefly transforming the environment into a conductor. In the fraction of a second following such an impact, any other Pokémon in the immediate vicinity found its own normal-type moves acquiring electrical charge. The battlefield became momentarily Zeraora's domain, not through force, but through the simple fact of having altered the conditions of the space. This quality, the ability to transform the environment rather than simply operate within it, was what the Alolan legends emphasized most consistently. Zeraora did not merely live in the electrical wilderness. It extended that wilderness wherever it went, carrying its charged atmosphere with it, the way a weather system carries its pressure gradient across a continent. The forests it frequented became, over time, slightly more electrically active than forests elsewhere. The storms that passed through its territory were by some accounts drawn to it, not because Zeraora summoned them, but because the electrical field it maintained created conditions that made lightning more likely, more frequent, more willing to find the earth. In the long intervals between sightings, Zeraora persisted somewhere in the deep wilderness, unreachable and unconcerned, trailing light through the dark spaces between the trees. Melton arrived in the world in a way that defied easy categorization. The small, liquid metal creature that began appearing in unusual concentrations across multiple regions simultaneously was not, at first, understood as a single species. Its appearance, a round, molten body with a single hexagonal eye and a tail of the same metallic substance, suggested something mechanical, something assembled rather than born. The truth was more unusual than either interpretation. Melton fed on metal, not in the way that some creatures consumed minerals as dietary supplements, but as a primary metabolic process, the absorption of iron, copper, steel, and other metallic materials from its environment, drawing them into its body and converting them into the liquid metal that constituted its physical form. The electrical current that ran through Melton's body served as the engine of this process, generating the charge necessary to break down metallic compounds and integrate them into living tissue. A group of Melton in proximity to a metal-rich environment would systematically reduce that environment, pulling its material into themselves with quiet, methodical thoroughness. The consequence of this feeding process, when it occurred collectively and at sufficient scale, was melmetal. The evolution of Melton into melmetal was not a transformation in the ordinary sense, not a single creature changing its form. It was a convergence. Multiple Melton, having accumulated enough metallic material and having spent what the legends described as 3,000 years in a process of gradual consolidation, merged their bodies into a single massive form. The liquid metal of many small creatures solidified into the immense, structured body of one ancient giant. Its double iron bash, the technique unique to its form, delivered with the full weight of that accumulated mass. Melmetal's significance in the traditions of the Pokémon world was partly material and partly symbolic. The metallic body that resulted from thousands of years of accumulation was, by the accounts of those who had studied it, extraordinarily durable, a consequence not of any single property, but of the layered, integrated nature of the material, each component having been processed through Meltan's bioelectric system before being incorporated into the whole. The legends of the ancient people who had reportedly observed Melmetal described it as a being of immense physical power that was nonetheless regarded with something closer to reverence than fear. The understanding that what stood before them had taken millennia to become itself, and that the patience required for such a becoming was its own form of power. The mystery that surrounded Meltan's origin, where it came from, how it reproduced, why it appeared in multiple locations simultaneously, pointed toward a history that the present world's records had not fully preserved. What remained was the observable fact of its existence, a creature that ate the world's metal and over the span of ages became something immovable from the weight of what it had consumed. The sky above the Alola region held in certain seasons and in certain conditions of light a quality of depth that was not purely atmospheric. The ultra wormholes that opened periodically in Alola's upper atmosphere were not natural features of the region's weather system. They were passages, openings between the dimension that contained the known world and the interstitial spaces that lay beyond it, places where the physics of ordinary reality applied differently or not at all. From these passages, occasionally things arrived. Cosmog arrived in such a manner, or at least that was the understanding embedded in the Alolan traditions surrounding it. The small, nebulous creature, its body a cluster of star-like particles contained within a cloud of cosmic gas, its face bearing the simple, unfocused expression of something that had not yet fully arrived in the world it now occupied, carried within it a potential that its appearance gave no indication of. Cosmog looked, to those who encountered it without context, like a small and fragile thing. It was neither. The gas that composed Cosmog's body was not decorative. It was the raw material of something much larger, a compressed form of the same cosmic substance from which the legendary Pokémon Solgaleo and Lunala had emerged across the generations. Cosmog's evolutionary line did not simply grow. It transformed in the manner of a star system undergoing formation, accumulating, condensing, shifting from nebulous potential into structured power. The intermediate form of Cosmoem, which Cosmog became as it developed, bore this out visually, a dense, golden shell encasing the compressed cosmic material within, the exterior hard and smooth as a jewel, the interior in a state of transformation that could not be observed from outside. What Cosmog could do in its early form was deceptive in its apparent simplicity. The creature could open ultra wormholes. Not reliably, not with complete control, and not without cost. The energy required for wormhole generation left Cosmog depleted, its body temporarily diminished. But the capability itself was extraordinary. A small, apparently fragile creature, carrying within its gaseous body the mechanism for tearing open the boundary between dimensions. The wormholes it generated were not stable passages. They were momentary ruptures, opening and closing in seconds, sufficient to allow passage but not to guarantee safety on either side. The Alalan royal family had, across generations, maintained a tradition of care for Cosmog, a recognition, preserved in the island's cultural memory, that the creature's dimensional capabilities made it both precious and dangerous, a thing that needed guidance rather than exploitation. The title of Lily's companion in the events surrounding the Ultra Beast crisis drew on this tradition, placing Cosmog, in that instance known as Nebby, at the center of a conflict whose resolution required the creature to complete its transformation and become the legendary it was always meant to be. The transformation, when it came, was not gradual. Cosmoem split. The dense shell cracked, and from within emerged either Solgaleo or Lunala, depending on the conditions of the world it was entering, the sun aspect or the moon aspect of the same fundamental cosmic energy. The creature that had arrived as a small, nebulous wanderer became in that moment one of the two great celestial guardians of the Alalan sky. The scale of the change was not merely physical, it was ontological, a fundamental shift in what the creature was and what its presence in the world meant. What the Alalan traditions noted quietly in the margins of the more dramatic accounts was that this transformation was not unique to a single Cosmog. The creature was not one of a kind. It reproduced in its fashion, and each new Cosmog carried the same potential, the same compressed cosmic substance, the same dimensional capabilities, the same eventual destiny. The universe, it seemed, had arranged for this particular form of power to remain available, seeding it across the dimensions in small, cloud-like packages that looked like nothing of consequence until they were. If Cosmog represented the potential of light, the compressed stellar energy awaiting its moment of expansion, then Necrozma represented what happened when that light was taken away. The creature that inhabited the ultraspace adjacent to the Alalan dimension had not always been what it was when the legends first described it. The ancient records of Alola, preserved in the murals of the Altar of the Sun and the Altar of the Moon, depicted Necrozma in a form that bore little resemblance to the fractured armored creature of the present era. In the murals, Necrozma appeared as a being of pure radiance, a creature whose body was composed entirely of the light it generated, giving that light freely to the worlds it visited, illuminating the ultraspace and the dimensions it touched with an energy that the ancient people of Alola had experienced as warmth, as growth, as the particular quality of a world that receives more light than it needs. That era ended when Necrozma was shattered. The murals did not record the exact nature of the attack, only its consequence. Necrozma's crystalline body, the structure through which it had channeled and distributed light, was broken. The light that had constituted its essential self dispersed. What remained was not death, but something in some ways more difficult, a continued existence without the substance that had made existence bearable. Necrozma persisted as a fractured shell, its original light gone, its body a collection of angular, black armor-like fragments held together by the hunger for what it had lost. The hunger drove everything that followed. Necrozma moved through the ultraspace and into connected dimensions seeking light, not as nutrition in the metabolic sense, but as the missing component of its own being, the substance it required to return to what it had been. The Pokémon it encountered became targets for this absorption. The worlds it passed through were dimmed by its passage. Alola, which had experienced Necrozma's generosity in the ancient era, experienced in the present era its deprivation, the creature that had once given light now taking it, not from malice, but from the simple, overwhelming fact of its need. The fusion forms that Necrozma achieved by absorbing Solgaleo or Lunala, Duskmane Necrozma, and Dawnwing's Necrozma respectively, represented the closest it could come to restoration without actually being restored. The light of Solgaleo or Lunala, absorbed into Necrozma's fractured body, allowed it to function again at something approaching its original capacity. Ultra Necrozma, the form achieved when Necrozma had absorbed sufficient light to temporarily reconstitute its radiant state, was the ancient creature briefly returned, a being of pure, overwhelming luminance, whose power in that form approached what the murals had depicted in the age before the shattering. But Ultra Necrozma could not sustain itself. The light it had absorbed was borrowed, not restored. The form held for as long as the energy lasted, and then collapsed back into the fractured shell, and the hunger returned. The tragedy embedded in Necrozma's existence was not its power or its danger, but this cyclical quality, the brief return to wholeness followed by the inevitable return to incompleteness, a pattern that had repeated across the ages since the shattering with no permanent resolution in sight. The ancient murals in Alola depicted both states, the radiant giver and the ravenous taker, as aspects of the same being, suggesting that the people who had made them understood something that later generations had to rediscover, that Necrozma was not a monster that had replaced a benefactor, but the benefactor itself, surviving its own destruction in the only way available to it. The light it had once given freely, it now sought desperately. The difference between the two states was not a difference in nature, but in circumstance. And circumstance, unlike nature, was something that could, in principle, be changed. The world's equatorial forests, dense and ancient, and layered with the accumulated organic complexity of centuries, had their own mythologies, their own creatures that the civilizations at their borders knew existed but rarely encountered directly. Zarude was one such creature, and the traditions surrounding it were shaped by this inaccessibility, a Pokémon known primarily through the evidence it left rather than through direct observation. The packs that Zarude formed were not simply social groups in the biological sense. The legends of the regions bordering Zarude's forest territories describe them as something closer to civilizations, organized communities with their own internal hierarchies, their own territorial boundaries, their own methods of communication carried through the rustling of the forest canopy in patterns that those outside the pack could not interpret. The vines that Zarude grew from its body served not only as tools and weapons, but as a connective tissue between pack members, a physical network that allowed information to pass between individuals through contact, binding the group into something that functioned with a coherence greater than any single member. Expulsion from the pack was the most severe consequence that Zarude society could impose. The legends recorded several accounts of solitary Zarude, individuals who had been cast out and who persisted alone at the margins of the forest. their behavior altered by isolation in ways that made them more aggressive, more territorial, more prone to the defensive violence that the pack structure would ordinarily have regulated. A Zarude without its pack was a creature stripped of its primary organizing principle, navigating the world with the instincts of a social animal, but without the social context those instincts required. The healing capability embedded in the vines that Zarude grew was significant enough to feature in every major account of the creature. The vines, when wrapped around a wound, accelerated recovery, not through any mystical mechanism, the scholars noted, but through the delivery of compounds produced in Zarude's own body that promoted cellular regeneration. The forest that Zarude inhabited was itself a kind of pharmacopoeia, and Zarude's body had, through the long process of its development, learned to synthesize and deliver its most useful properties. A pack of Zarude moving through their territory was not simply a group of powerful creatures. It was a mobile system of forest knowledge, carrying in their bodies the distilled medicinal wisdom of the ecosystem they had inhabited for generations. The film record associated with Zarude, specifically the account of a solitary, expelled Zarude who raised a human child in the depths of its forest, added a dimension to the creature's mythology that the purely ecological accounts had not captured. The capacity for attachment that Zarude demonstrated in that account, the willingness to extend the vine connection that ordinarily bound pack members to a creature that was not Zarude at all, suggested that the social intelligence of the species ran deeper than pack loyalty. It suggested something that the legends, in their careful observational restraint, described only as care, the extension of protective attention to something that needed it, regardless of what that something was. The forest held Zarude's secrets in its canopy, in the movement of its leaves, in the paths worn by generations of passage that were invisible to those who did not know how to read them. And the forest, unlike the creatures that moved through it, did not forget. Kubfu arrived in the world's awareness not through cataclysm or cosmic necessity, but through the slower, quieter process of tradition, the passing of knowledge from one practitioner to the next across generations, the refinement of physical discipline into something that approached philosophy. The Isle of Armor, the territory associated with Kubfu's origin and training, carried in its landscape the evidence of this long process, the towers of two fists standing at its interior, their architecture ancient and deliberately austere, built to serve as the environment for a specific kind of becoming. The bear-like creature that Kubfu appeared to be at first encounter was not inaccurate, but it was incomplete. The biological form, compact, physically capable, bearing the markings of a creature built for close-range engagement, was the container for something that the form alone could not convey. Kubfu was a practitioner in the most fundamental sense, a creature whose nature was defined not by what it was, but by what it was in the process of becoming through the application of disciplined effort. The legends of the Isle of Armor described Kubfu not as a powerful creature that required training, but as a creature that was, in its essential nature, the act of training itself, a being whose existence was inseparable from the process of refinement. The Towers of Two Fists presented Kubfu with a choice that was not merely tactical. The Tower of Waters and the Tower of Darkness Each housed a different lineage of physical discipline, each one developed across centuries by the masters who had used the towers as their proving grounds. To ascend the Tower of Waters was to pursue a style rooted in the principle of flow, the understanding that force was most effective when it moved like water, finding the path of least resistance, adapting to whatever shape the obstacle presented. To ascend the Tower of Darkness was to pursue a style rooted in the principle of penetration, the understanding that certain obstacles required not adaptation but the focused application of concentrated force, the single strike delivered with total commitment. Kubfu that climbed the Tower of Waters and faced its trials emerged as Urshifu in the single strike style, the dark type practitioner of the penetrating blow. Kubfu that climbed the Tower of Darkness and faced its trials emerged as Urshifu in the rapid strike style, the water type practitioner of flowing adaptation. The inversion, water producing darkness, darkness producing water, was not an error in the tradition. It was a teaching embedded in the structure of the towers themselves, that the mastery of a principle required the practitioner to understand its opposite, to have faced it in the tower's trials, and found within it not contradiction, but complement. The training that prepared Kubfu for the towers was not a curriculum of techniques. The masters of the Isle of Armor, in the accounts that had been preserved, described the preparation as the cultivation of a particular quality of attention, the capacity to be fully present in the moment of engagement, without anticipation and without retrospection, meeting each trial as it arrived rather than as it had been imagined in advance. Kubfu's small body carried this attention as a physical quality, the stillness before movement that practitioners of every martial tradition recognized as the condition from which effective action could emerge. Mustard, the former champion whose tenure on the Isle of Armor predated the events of the present era, had trained his own Urshifu through the same towers and had preserved the tradition across decades, passing it to the next generation of practitioners, with the understanding that the tower's trials were not obstacles to be overcome, but mirrors to be faced. What the tower showed a practitioner was not the tower's challenge. It was the practitioner's own nature, presented back to them in the form of an adversary they could not defeat through technique alone. Kubfu's evolution into Urshifu was therefore not a graduation. It was a recognition, the towers acknowledging, in the form of transformation, that the creature had seen itself clearly and had not looked away. The physical power that Urshifu carried was the consequence of this recognition, not its cause. The blow that could not be blocked. Wicked blow in the single strike style, surging strikes in the rapid strike style, landed with certainty not because of strength, but because of the quality of attention behind it, the practitioner's total commitment to the moment of impact. The Isle of Armor held both towers in its interior, their stone worn smooth by the passage of centuries and the hands of every practitioner who had climbed them. The tradition they housed had survived the rise and fall of regional powers, the shifting of political structures, the accumulation of technological change that had altered almost every other aspect of the world's daily life. It persisted because what it preserved was not a system of fighting, but a way of meeting the world, and that, unlike almost everything else, did not become obsolete. In the quiet between the towers, The wind moved across the Isle of Armor with the particular steadiness of a place that had been arranged, deliberately and long ago, for the purpose of paying attention. The stone absorbed the sound of it. The grass bent and straightened, and somewhere in the training grounds below, a small, compact creature with the markings of a practitioner moved through its forms, not yet what it would become, but already, in every motion, in the process of becoming it. Before the first seed split open in the dark soil, before the first harvest was carried in from fields still warm with late summer light, there existed a kind of covenant between the land and those who worked it. That covenant was not written. It was not spoken aloud. It lived in the rhythm of planting and waiting, in the particular silence of a field at dawn when the dew had not yet lifted and the air held the smell of turned earth and possibility. Across the Galar region, in the high cold country of the Crown Tundra, that ancient covenant found its embodiment in a creature so old that the people who remembered it had themselves become legend. Calyrex arrived not as a conqueror, but as a custodian. The records preserved in the Crown Tundra described a small, unassuming figure, a pale, equine shape, crowned with a structure resembling both a throne and a flowering plant, seated with the stillness of something that had long since stopped needing to prove its authority. Ancient texts referred to Calyrex as the High King, a title that carried agricultural weight as much as political meaning. In those early centuries, the people of the region understood that the land did not produce on its own. Something had to tend it. Something had to remember it. Calyrex remembered. The rituals that surrounded Calyrex were not performances of worship in any conventional sense. They were agricultural calendars made sacred. Communities gathered at the turning of seasons to enact ceremonies that in their earliest forms corresponded directly to Calyrex's known abilities, the capacity to stimulate growth, to read the movements of weather, to understand what the soil needed before the soil had any way of communicating its need. Calyrex possessed a form of psychic perception that extended not merely into the minds of individuals, but into the living fabric of the land itself. Roots, moisture, temperature, the slow chemical conversation between fungus and root network, all of it was legible to Calyrex in a way that no human instrument could replicate. The people of the Crown Tundra did not find this supernatural. They found it reliable. What made Calyrex's story unusual, even among legendary figures, was the nature of its diminishment. At some point in the region's history, the records grew fragmentary here, worn down by time and the carelessness of successive generations. Calyrex lost its steed. The two horses it had once commanded, Glostrier and Spectrier, had separated from it. Without them, Calyrex retained its intelligence and its memory, but the raw power that had made it capable of governing the land's growth faded to something far quieter. The High King became a figure of the past, present in appearance but diminished in function, wandering the tundra like an elder whose authority had outlasted the institutions that gave it meaning. The ceremonies persisted even after Calyrex's power waned, carried forward by communities that understood something important. The ritual itself was a form of memory. By enacting the planting rites, by performing the seasonal acknowledgments, the people kept alive the knowledge of what Calyrex had once represented. The covenant between the land and its custodian remained, even if the custodian had grown quiet. And in that quietness, Calyrex waited, not with impatience, but with the particular patience of something that understood cycles well enough to know that what had separated would in time converge again. The reunification of Calyrex with its steed required an act of trust and an act of remembrance, a person willing to participate in the ancient ritual, to plant the ice root carrot or the shade root carrot in the appropriate soil, and thereby call back what had been lost. The carrot itself was significant. Root vegetables, in many agricultural traditions, represented the hidden work of sustenance, the nourishment that grew underground, invisible, requiring faith. Calyrex's return to full power through the planting of a root was not an accident of game design. It was a continuation of the logic that had always governed its mythology, that the land and its guardian required active participation from those who benefited from them. The covenant was never one-sided. Reunited with Glastrier, Calyrex became Calyrex Ice Rider, armored in frost, commanding the cold that preserved as much as it isolated. Reunited with Spectrier, it became Calyrex Shadow Rider, wreathed in the particular darkness of things that move between states of being, commanding the boundary between the living and the memoried. Both forms represented aspects of the agricultural cycle that had no comfortable names in ordinary language. The cold that kept the seed dormant until spring. The shadow that marked the end of the growing season and the beginning of the fallow time. Calyrex, in all its forms, was not merely a king. It was the full vocabulary of the land's relationship with time. Urshifu's origins were rooted in a different kind of ancient knowledge, one that concerned not the land, but the self. The Isle of Armor in Galar housed a dojo that had stood for generations, its wooden beams smoothed by the passage of countless hands, its training floor carrying the particular smell of old cedar and effort. Within that dojo, a lineage of martial practice had accumulated over centuries, and at the center of that lineage stood the towers, two structures built at the island's far reaches, each encoding a different understanding of what it meant to fight. The Tower of Waters and the Tower of Darkness were not merely training facilities. They were philosophical arguments made architectural. The Tower of Darkness held that true strength emerged from a single, decisive commitment, one strike, perfectly placed, carrying the full weight of the fighter's intention. The Tower of Waters held the opposite view, that true strength was found in the capacity to persist, to absorb, to flow around resistance rather than meeting it head-on. Both towers were ancient. Both had shaped fighters thus long before Urshifu existed as a species. When Urshifu arrived at the Isle of Armor as a young Kubfu, it carried within its body the genetic potential for either path. Kubfu's temperament was already formed, serious, watchful, with a particular intensity in its gaze that suggested it was always measuring the distance between where it stood and where it needed to be. Its training at the dojo was rigorous in a specific way, not merely physical conditioning, but the cultivation of a relationship between the fighter and their chosen principle. A Kubfu that entered the Tower of Darkness was not simply learning a technique, it was making a declaration about the nature of commitment. A Kubfu that entered the Tower of Waters was not simply learning flexibility. It was accepting that strength and yielding were not opposites, but expressions of the same underlying truth. The evolution into Urshifu was therefore not a biological event alone. It was the completion of a philosophical education. Single strike style Urshifu moved through combat with a quality that could only be called conviction. Every strike aimed at a single vital point, every movement stripped of hesitation. The wicked blow, its signature technique, carried a darkness that was not malevolent, but absolute. It did not spread, it did not linger, it landed, and the matter was settled. Rapid strike style. Urshifu moved differently, with a fluidity that made it appear unhurried, even in the midst of sustained attack. Surging strikes, its signature technique, arrived in continuous waves, each one building on the last, wearing down resistance the way water wore down stone. Both styles were equally valid. That was the crucial understanding preserved in the dojo's teachings. The island did not declare one tower superior to the other. The path chosen was a reflection of the individual Kubfu's nature, not a judgment about which philosophy deserved to win. What the towers tested was not strength in the conventional sense. It was integrity. A Kubfu that reached the summit of either tower had demonstrated not merely that it could fight, but that it understood why it was fighting and had committed to that understanding completely. The evolution that followed was a recognition of that commitment, a physical transformation that expressed what had already become true internally. The dual nature of Urshifu's existence raised a question that the island's traditions never fully resolved, whether the two styles could ever be reconciled, or whether the commitment to one necessarily foreclosed the other. The traditions suggested that the choice once made was permanent, not as a punishment, but as a form of integrity. A fighter who could be both decisive and yielding depending on convenience had not truly chosen either path. The permanence of the evolution was the permanence of the choice, and in that permanence there was a kind of freedom that only comes from having fully committed to something. In the quieter reaches of the crown tundra, in chambers that had been sealed for centuries, two other presences waited in the particular stillness of things that had been made rather than born. Regieleki and Regidrago did not emerge from myth the way Calyrex did, accumulating legend through generations of agricultural ceremony. They emerged from intention, from the deliberate work of an ancient civilization that had already demonstrated its capacity for extraordinary construction through the earlier golems, and that had returned to that work with a more ambitious set of questions. The ancient people who created the original Regis had understood something fundamental about the relationship between form and function. Regirock, Regis, and Registeel each embodied a material, stone, ice, metal, and in embodying it, became a kind of pure expression of that material's properties. They were not merely made of those substances. They were those substances given will and locomotion. The civilization that created them had approached the problem of artificial life the way a philosopher approaches a problem of definition, by stripping away everything inessential until only the core remained. Regieleki represented the next step in that philosophical program. Electricity, unlike stone or ice or metal, was not a material in the conventional sense. It was a process, the movement of charge, the consequence of potential difference, the force that moved through things rather than residing in them. To create a body that was electricity in the same way Regirock was stone required a different kind of thinking. The ancient makers solved this by constructing Regieleki not as a container for electrical energy, but as a circuit, a form whose entire structure was the pathway that electricity traveled. The rings that surrounded its body were not decorative. They were functional components of a system that allowed it to generate and discharge energy at a rate that exceeded anything else in the natural world. Regieleki became, in the language of its creator's intent, the purest possible expression of electrical potential, a living circuit with no other purpose and no other form. Regidrago presented a different problem. Dragon energy, unlike electricity, was not a physical phenomenon that could be measured or mapped. It was a quality, something that existed in the oldest and most powerful creatures, something that accumulated over vast spans of time, something that could be sensed but not easily defined. The ancient makers, working with the remains of ancient dragons, attempted to concentrate that quality into a discrete form. Regidrago's body, composed of crystallized dragon energy and the remnants of those ancient creatures, carried within it something that felt less like construction and more like compression, as though an enormous amount of something very old had been pressed into a shape that could move and act in the present. The heads that formed Regidrago's hands were not merely aesthetic choices. They were the visible evidence of the source material, the ancient dragon remains from which its energy had been drawn. Regidrago's roar carried within it the accumulated resonance of creatures that had lived and died long before the current age of Pokémon, and that resonance functioned as both a weapon and a record. To hear Regidrago was to hear, in some attenuated form, the sound of something far older than the creature producing it. The ancient makers had not merely built a body, they had built an archive. Both Regieleki and Regidrago were sealed in their respective chambers, not because they were considered failures, but because their power was understood to be beyond the capacity of the civilization's current moment to manage. The sealing was a form of responsible stewardship, the acknowledgement that some things, once made, require conditions that do not yet exist before they can be safely encountered. The chambers held so the centuries passed, and the two artificial beings waited in the cold dark of the tundra, neither growing nor diminishing, simply persisting in the way that made things are sometimes obligated to persist. Glastrier and Spectrier, unlike the Regis, were not made. They emerged from the landscape itself, from the particular intensities of two environments at the Crown Tundra's extremes, and they carried in their bodies the distilled character of those places. Glastrier came from the ice fields, the regions of the tundra, where the cold was not a season but a permanent condition, where the light that reached the ground had already been filtered through layers of cloud and ice crystal until it arrived pale and diffuse, carrying almost no warmth. The ice that formed Glastrier's hooves and the frost that accumulated along its mane were not accretions. They were expressions of its nature, the way that a creature of sufficient cold eventually becomes cold rather than merely inhabiting it. Glastrier's movements were heavy with the weight of absolute temperature. When it ran, the ground beneath its hooves did not merely freeze, it transformed, the moisture in the soil crystallizing instantly into structures that persisted long after the horse had passed. The path Glastrier traveled became a record of its passage, a frozen archive of motion laid into the earth. Its temperament was singular. Glastrier wanted what it wanted with a directness that left no room for negotiation. The ancient records noted that Glastrier's desire for the ice root carrot, the tuber that grew only in the most frigid soil of the tundra, was not a preference, but a compulsion, the kind of drive that operates below the level of choice. This was not a flaw. It was a consequence of being a creature whose entire nature was organized around a single principle: the cold that persists, the cold that does not yield, the cold that holds the shape of things through winter, so that spring has something to return to. Spectrier inhabited the opposite extreme, the shaded valleys of the crown tundra, where the light never quite reached the ground, and the air carried the particular quality of places that exist between states, not quite dark, not quite light, not quite warm, not quite cold. These were Spectrier's territories. The horse moved through them like something that had learned to occupy the space between visibility and absence. Its body did not absorb light so much as decline to reflect it, and the purple luminescence that gathered around its eyes was the only indication, in certain conditions, that it was present at all. Spectrier fed on the life energy of sleeping creatures, not consuming them, but drawing from them the particular warmth that living things generate even in their stillness. The ancient people of the crown tundra understood this not as predation, but as a kind of ecological relationship, the way that certain fungi drew nutrients from their hosts without killing them. Spectrier required what sleeping things generated, and sleeping things, for reasons no one had fully documented, seemed to experience its presence as something closer to depth than disturbance. The dreams that occurred in Spectrier's vicinity were described in old texts as unusually vivid, unusually coherent, as though the horse's proximity to the boundary between waking and sleeping made the dreaming mind more fluent in its own language. The separations of both horses from Calyrex remained, in the traditions of the crown tundra, a wound in the landscape's memory. The land that Calyrex had once governed with their power had grown quieter, the harvest less certain, the seasons less predictable. The people who maintained the agricultural rituals understood, in the way that communities sometimes understand things without being able to articulate them precisely, that the separation was the source of the imbalance. Calyrex without its steed was intelligence without the force to act on it. Glastrier or Spectrier without Calyrex was power without the wisdom to govern it. The reunion was not merely a restoration, it was a rebalancing of something that had been out of alignment for a very long time. Among the forces that governed seasonal transformation in the Hisui region, Inamoris occupied a position that was simultaneously intimate and immense. The other members of the forces of nature, Tornatus, Thunduris, Landoris, had long been understood as expressions of elemental energy: wind, lightning, earth. They arrived in storms, they departed in calm, and their presence was felt primarily as disruption. Inamoris arrived differently. The traditions of the Hisui people described Inamoris as the bringer of spring, not in the meteorological sense of warming temperatures and longer days, but in the deeper sense of the return of willingness. Spring, in the agricultural understanding of ancient peoples, was not merely a change in weather. It was the moment when the land remembered that it was capable of growth, when seeds that had spent months in frozen suspension remembered their purpose, when the creatures that had sheltered through winter emerged and found the world altered in their favor. Inamoris governed that remembering. Its arrival in the region was understood as the signal that the long stillness was ending. Enamorus took the form of a serpentine figure wreathed in cloud, its coloration shifting between the pink of early cherry blossoms and the deeper rose of full bloom. The imagery was precise. Cherry blossoms, in many East Asian traditions, represented the beauty of transience, the particular grace of things that arrived fully and departed quickly. Enamorus did not linger. It came, it changed what needed changing, and it withdrew, leaving behind a landscape that had been reminded of its capacity for renewal. Its incarnate form moved through the air with the fluid ease of something that had no fixed relationship with the ground, its serpentine body coiling through cloud cover, its presence announced by the sudden softening of air temperature and the particular smell of soil that had just begun to thaw. The Therian form, which revealed itself to those who understood the ancient flutes used to call the forces of nature into their truer shapes, was more grounded, more concentrated, the same energy organized into a form that could make direct contact with the earth it governed. The love that Enamorus was said to carry was not sentimental, it was agricultural. The ancient Hisuians did not draw a sharp line between the love that existed between people and the love that the land expressed when it produced food for those people. Enamorus was understood to embody both simultaneously, the warmth that moved between living things and the warmth that moved through the soil when winter finally released its grip. To encounter Enamorus was to be reminded that these were the same warmth, expressed in different registers. Spring was not merely a season, it was the land's annual demonstration that it still cared for the things that lived on it. The forces of nature as a group represented a cosmology in which weather was not random, but intentional, in which the storms that destroyed and the seasons that renewed were expressions of the same underlying system, a system that required all its components to function correctly. Enamorus completed that system not by adding destruction to the mix, but by adding the capacity for recovery. Without Enamorus, the cycle of storm and lightning and earthen upheaval that the other three forces embodied would have no resolution. With it, every season of difficulty was followed by a season of return. The cycle breathed. Wyrdeer moved through the forests of Hisui with the particular authority of something that had been in those forests long enough to become part of their structure. The ancient deer, ancestor to the more commonly known stantler, carried within its antlers a concentration of psychic energy that the Hishun people understood as a form of spiritual perception. The beads that formed within those antlers were not decorations. They were condensed expressions of the forest's memory, accumulated over the years of Wyrdeer's passage through the same paths, the same clearings, the same stands of ancient cedar and pine. The Hisuian traditions described Wyrdeer as a guardian not in the military sense of a creature that defended territory, but in the custodial sense of a creature that maintained the integrity of a place. Wyrdeer knew the forest in the way that the forest knew itself, completely, without gaps, with an awareness of every change and every continuity. When a tree fell, Wyrdeer knew. When a spring shifted course, Wyrdeer knew. When a creature that did not belong to the forest entered its boundaries, Wyrdeer knew that too, and the knowledge settled into the beads of its antlers, like sediment settling into the bottom of a still pool. The psychic field that Wyrdeer projected was not aggressive. It was clarifying. Those who moved through the forest in Werdier's vicinity reported that the paths seemed more legible, the landmarks more distinct, the sense of direction more reliable. The ancient Hisuians understood this as Wyrdir, sharing its knowledge of the forest with those who traveled through it, not through any deliberate act of communication, but through the simple overflow of a consciousness so thoroughly mapped to its environment that proximity to it made the environment more comprehensible. Wyrdir's role in the spiritual life of the Hisuian people extended beyond the practical. The deer appeared in ceremonies marking significant transitions, births, deaths, the beginning of planting season, the end of harvest. Its presence at these ceremonies was understood as a form of witnessing. The forest, through Wyrdir, acknowledging the significant moments in the lives of the people who shared its boundaries. The relationship was reciprocal in a way that the Hisuians took seriously. They did not hunt Wyrdir. They did not disturb the paths it traveled. In exchange, the forest remained legible, the psychic field remained stable, and the boundary between the human settlement and the wild interior of the land remained a threshold rather than a wall. The spiritual weight that Wyrdir carried in the Hisuian worldview was inseparable from its physical presence. The creature's size, considerably larger than its Stantler descendants, communicated something important about scale. This was not a shy animal, not a creature that lived at the margins of human awareness. Wyrdir was visible, deliberate, present. It moved through the forest with a quality of intention that made it seem less like it was traveling through the trees and more like it was reading them, checking in with each one, maintaining a relationship that had been ongoing for longer than anyone could accurately measure. The rivers and coastal waters of Hisui held their own histories, and among the most unusual was the story of Basculegion, a creature whose very existence represented a transformation that moved in the opposite direction from most evolutionary processes. Where most evolution carried a species toward greater vitality, Basculegion's transformation carried Basculin towards something that incorporated death itself as a constitutive element. The Basculin of Hisui were known for their migrations, long, difficult journeys upstream against powerful currents, through waters cold enough to carry a physical ache, across distances that claimed many of the school before it reached its destination. The Hisuian people observed these migrations with a mixture of respect and sorrow. Many Basculin did not survive. Their bodies sank into the river, and the current carried whatever remained of them downstream back toward the sea. But something else remained in the water, something that the living Basculin carried forward. The souls of the fallen, the Hisuian traditions used this language without apology, accumulated within the bodies of the survivors. Not as a burden exactly, but as a weight. The Basculin that completed the migration carried within them the accumulated presence of all those who had not. Over time, as this accumulation grew heavy enough, as the weight of the carried souls reached a threshold that the living body could no longer simply contain, the transformations occurred. Basculegion emerged not as a larger or stronger Basculin, but as something fundamentally different, a creature whose body was haunted in the most literal sense, the ghostly presences of the fallen school expressed visibly as spectral shapes that surrounded and moved through its physical form. The ectoplasmic substance that wreathed Basculegion was not separate from it. It was the accumulated presence of the dead, given a form that moved with the living creature, that fought alongside it, that expressed in every battle the weight of everything that had been lost in order for this one creature to survive. Basculegion's power in combat was therefore not merely its own, it was the power of the entire school, concentrated into a single body, directed by the one that had endured. The Hisuian understanding of this transformation was not macabre. It was ecological and spiritual simultaneously. The dead did not simply disappear. They persisted in the form of the living that carried them, and that persistence gave the living a depth of purpose that straightforward survival could not provide. Basculegion did not simply exist in the river. It existed as the river's memory of every basculin that had tried to cross it. The transformation was a form of accounting, a way of ensuring that the sacrifice of the many was not lost, but was instead incorporated into the ongoing life of the species in a form that could be witnessed and understood. In the deep marshes of the Hisui region, where the soil carried the smell of centuries of organic accumulation and the light filtered through cattail and fog in equal measure, another transformation was governed not by water or migration, but by the moon. Ursaluna descended from Ursaring, the large brown bear that had long been part of the region's ecological fabric. But the conditions of Hisui, the particular quality of the moonlight that fell on its wetland territories, the specific mineral content of the soil it inhabited, the ancient energies that the Hisuian traditions understood as permeating the landscape in a way that could not be measured but could be felt, produced in certain Ursaring a sensitivity to lunar cycles that went far beyond seasonal behavior. The full moon, in the Hisuian understanding, was not merely a light source. It was a transmission, a regular pulse of energy that the land received and processed, that living things absorbed in proportion to their sensitivity to it. Ursaluna's sensitivity was extreme. Under a full moon, the transformation that produced Ursaluna from Ursaring was not gradual. It was complete, and it expressed itself in a form that suggested the moon's energy had reorganized something fundamental about the creature's relationship with the earth beneath it. Ursaluna's body became broader, lower to the ground. Its limbs thickened in a way that suggested not merely increased mass, but increased contact, as though the creature were pressing itself more thoroughly into relationship with the soil. The crescent marking on its forehead was the most visible sign of the lunar connection, a physical record of the energy that had shaped it. But the more significant change was the one that could not be seen directly: Ursaluna's ability to sense what lay beneath the surface. The Hisuian people discovered that Ursaluna could locate things buried in the earth, not through scent alone, though its olfactory capacity was considerable, but through a form of perception that seemed to extend downward through the soil in the way that certain instruments extended their sensitivity through water. Ancient objects, hidden caches, the remnants of things long buried by time and accumulation, Ursaluna found them with a reliability that the Hisuians came to depend on. The relationship that developed between the people and the lunar bear was therefore practical as well as spiritual. Ursaluna was a navigator of what lay beneath, a living instrument for reading the buried history of the land. The moon's governance of Ursaluna's transformation was understood as a form of appointment, the lunar cycle designating in each full moon the moment at which a sufficiently prepared Ursaring could make the transition. Not all Ursaring made it. The preparation required was not merely biological. The Hisuian traditions suggested that Ursaluna's emergence required a specific alignment between the creature's internal state and the external conditions of the moon and the marsh, a convergence that could not be forced, only recognized when it arrived. The patience required was considerable, and patience, in the Hisui region's spiritual understanding, was itself a form of readiness. Far to the south, in the Paldea region, the earth itself held memories that predated the current era of human civilization by an enormous margin. The ruinous Pokémon, Chi-Yu, Qian-Pao, Wo-Chien, and Ting-Lu, were not natural creatures in the conventional sense. They were consequences. Each had emerged from the accumulation of human emotion, specifically negative human emotion, concentrated into vessels that were ancient before the current age of Paldea began. Ting-Lu's origin was the most terrestrial of the four. The ancient vessel that had given it form was a ritual urn, a container used in ceremonies that the earliest peoples of the Paldea region had conducted to appease or communicate with the forces they understood to govern the earth. The urn had been buried in soil, had remained there through centuries of geological and cultural change, and during that time had absorbed something that the Paldean traditions could only describe as the accumulated weight of fear. Fear of the earth's instability, fear of the ground that moved and swallowed, fear of the mountain that changed its shape in a single afternoon, of the valley that filled with water in a season, of the landscape that refused to remain legible. The urn had been the vessel into which those fears were ritually deposited, a way of externalizing the terror so that it could be managed, contained, given a location. And the fears, once deposited, did not dissipate. They accumulated. Over centuries, they grew dense enough to generate a will of their own, and that will organized itself around the urn's original association with the earth and with the weight of what the earth could do to those who lived on it. Ting-Lu emerged as a creature of enormous mass and deliberate movement, a dark figure whose antlered head and massive body communicated the weight of the earth it represented, and whose vessel-shaped marking recalled the urn that had been its origin. Its ruination ability, which halved the total HP of every creature in its vicinity, was not a weapon in the conventional sense. It was the expression of what it was, a concentration of everything that the earth could take away, made active and directed. To face Ting-Lu was to face the accumulated fear of geological time, the understanding embedded in the oldest human memories that the ground beneath your feet was not a guarantee. The Paldean traditions that preserved knowledge of the ruinous Pokémon were ambivalent in a way that distinguished them from most legendary lore. Ting-Lu and its companions were not celebrated, they were acknowledged. The distinction mattered. Celebration implied approval, a desire for the thing to continue. Acknowledgement implied something more complex. The recognition that these creatures existed, that they had emerged from real human experience, that they represented aspects of the world that could not be wished away. The ancient people of Paldea had not created the ruinous Pokémon intentionally. They had created them accidentally through the sincere and repeated act of depositing their deepest fears into vessels that proved more receptive than anyone had anticipated. The sealing of the ruinous Pokémon by the legendary figure known as the Pokémon that shaped Chaldean history was not a destruction. It was a containment, the recognition that what had been created could not be unmade, but could be held. The stakes used to bind them were not punishments. They were agreements, a way of saying that these accumulations of human fear would remain present in the landscape, acknowledged but not free to act without limit. The sealing preserved something important about the relationship between the people of Chaldea and the darker aspects of their own history. The fears that had created Ting Lu had been real. The creature that emerged from them was real. The stakes acknowledged both. In the quiet that followed the long survey of all these figures, the High King of the Tundra, the martial philosopher of the island dojo, the artificial beings sealed in ancient chambers, the horses born from ice and shadow, the serpentine bringer of spring, the psychic deer of the ancient forest, the ghost-wreathed survivor of impossible migrations, the lunar bear of the wetlands, the earthen accumulation of ancient fear, something became visible that had not been visible in any single story. The mythical and legendary Pokémon of every region, examined together, constituted not merely a collection of powerful creatures, they constituted a cosmology, a complete account of how the world worked, expressed not in abstract principles, but in embodied forms that could be encountered, that could be lost and found, that could diminish and return, that could be created and sealed and reunited and transformed. Every fundamental principle that governed existence had its expression in this cosmology. Creation and destruction, time and space, life and death, growth and decay, memory and forgetting, the seen and the unseen. Arceus had established the frame, the primordial act of creation that gave the universe its initial structure. Within that frame, Dialga and Palkia governed the dimensions that made experience possible, the forward movement of time, the spatial extension of matter. Giratina held the space between, the antimatter realm that existence required as its counterpart. Rayquaza mediated the atmospheric boundary between worlds. Groudon and Kyogre shaped the surfaces on which life would eventually stand. Ho-Oh and Lugia governed the emotional and elemental registers of the natural world. The legendary birds and beasts maintained the balance of seasons and cycles within regions. But the mythical figures, the smaller, stranger, more intimate ones, occupied a different register of the cosmology. They were not architects of the frame. They were the texture of what happened inside it. Celebi preserved the living memory of the past. Jirachi granted wishes in the space between sleep and waking. Shaman restored what had been damaged. Darkrai inhabited the difficult country of the unconscious. Mew carried the genetic memory of everything that had ever lived. Each of these figures addressed not the structure of reality, but the experience of living within it, the specific, granular, felt quality of being a creature in a world that was simultaneously generous and dangerous. The agricultural mythology of Calyrex addressed the most fundamental anxiety of any civilization that depended on the land, that the covenant between people and earth was not guaranteed, that it required maintenance, that it could be disrupted and needed to be restored. The martial philosophy embedded in Urshifu's dual evolution addressed the question of how a self becomes coherent, how a creature with the potential for multiple paths commits to one, and in doing so becomes something more than potential. Regieleki and Regidrago address the question of what it meant to create life deliberately, to take the raw material of natural forces and organize them into something that had will and form. Glastrier and Spectrier address the two faces of the cold season, the preserving cold and the darkening cold, and the necessity of both for the cycle to complete itself. Enamorus addressed what the other forces of nature could not: the capacity for recovery, the annual proof that the world intended to continue. Weird Deer addressed the relationship between a community and the landscape it inhabited, the importance of maintaining an entity whose consciousness was so thoroughly mapped to a place that its presence made the place more intelligible to everyone who moved through it. Basculegion addressed the relationship between the living and the dead, not as a horror, but as an ongoing conversation, the dead persisting in the living in a form that gave the living greater depth and purpose. Ursaluna addressed the hidden history of the land itself, the buried layers that could be read if you had the right kind of sensitivity and the patience to let the moon tell you when to look. Ting Lu and the ruinous Pokémon as a group addressed something that most mythological traditions preferred to avoid: the fact that human emotion accumulated over sufficient time and deposited in sufficient concentration could generate forces that operated independently of human intention. The fears and resentments and griefs that people had poured into ancient vessels had not simply dissolved. They had organized. They had become. The ruinous Pokémon were not punishments for human weakness. They were consequences of human sincerity, of the genuine depth of feeling that the ancient Chaldeans had brought to their rituals of exorcism and appeasement. The creatures that emerged from those rituals were as real as the emotions that had created them. What the complete cosmology of legendary and mythical Pokémon revealed, when examined from sufficient distance, was a worldview that refused to separate the natural from the spiritual, the ecological from the emotional, the cosmic from the agricultural. The same universe that contained Arceus contained Calyrex. The same world that held the vast indifference of space held the specific, local, deeply personal relationship between a community and the deer that wandered its forest. The scale shifted constantly, from the primordial to the intimate, from the geological to the seasonal, from the ancient to the immediately present. But the underlying logic remained consistent, that the world was full of forces that had intention, that those forces could be understood, that the relationship between living things and those forces required active maintenance, and that the failure to maintain those relationships had consequences that accumulated quietly until they could no longer be ignored. The Pokémon that inhabited the space between ordinary and legendary, the mythical figures, the regional variants, the ancient forms that emerged from Hisui and Paldea and the Crown Tundra, did not contradict the larger cosmology. They completed it. They filled in the registers that the great architects and destroyers could not address, the middle scales of existence, the textures of daily and seasonal and generational life, the specific anxieties and hopes of communities that lived close enough to the land to feel its moods, and far enough from the cosmic scale to need intermediaries between themselves and the forces that governed their world. The world that all of these figures inhabited was not a world that had been created and then left to run on its own. It was a world that required continuous tending. Calyrex had to be reunited with its steed. The forces of nature had to maintain their balance. The ruinous Pokémon had to remain sealed, or the accumulated fears they embodied would move unchecked through the landscape. The rivers had to receive the migrations that produced Bascolagion. The moon had to be allowed to do its work on the marshes of Hisui. Every figure in the cosmology was a reminder that the world was not a static creation, but a continuous process, that the forces which had shaped it at the beginning were still active, still requiring acknowledgement, still capable of diminishment, if the relationships that sustained them were allowed to lapse. The ancient peoples who had developed these traditions understood something that later generations sometimes forgot, that the legends were not merely stories, they were instructions. The agricultural ceremonies surrounding Calyrex were instructions for maintaining the covenant between people and land. The dojo traditions of the Isle of Armor were instructions for the development of a coherent self. The sealing of the ruinous Pokémon was an instruction in responsible stewardship of the consequences of collective emotion. The observation of Werdir's paths through the forest was an instruction in the importance of maintaining entities whose consciousness served as a map for the community. The cosmology held. It held because it was comprehensive enough to address the full range of human experience, not merely the grand questions of creation and destruction, but the specific, seasonal, agricultural, emotional, martial, ecological, spiritual questions that living creatures faced in the course of their actual lives. The legendary figures address the grand questions. The mythical figures address the specific ones. Together, they constituted a complete account of what it meant to live in a world that was alive in every register, from the cosmic to the intimate, from the ancient to the immediately present. And the world that contained all of them continued, as it had always continued, cycling through its seasons, maintaining its covenants, absorbing its losses, recovering its capacity for growth, sealing what needed to be sealed, and releasing what needed to be released. The High King moved through the tundra with its steed restored. The ancient golems waited in their chambers for the conditions that would make their presence meaningful again. The spring arrived each year in the serpentine form of Anamoris, reminding the land of its own willingness. The deer moved through the forest, and the forest remained legible to those who moved through it with care. The souls of the fallen moved with the living through the river. The moon rose over the marsh, and the bear that was ready received what the moon had to offer. The earth held its memories, and the creatures born from human fear remained contained within their stakes, present but not free, acknowledged but not celebrated, a permanent reminder that the deepest feelings of the oldest peoples did not simply vanish, but persisted in the landscape in forms that could be encountered, respected, and carefully left undisturbed. The story did not end. It settled the way all great cycles eventually settle, not into silence, but into the particular quality of sound that follows a long telling, when the air still carries the shape of the words that have moved through it, and the world that has been described continues on the other side of the description, cycling and tending and remembering, as it has always done, as it will continue to do, long after the last voice that named it has grown quiet.